On the day I discovered I wasn't allowed to stand beside my son at the altar, I was holding the receipt confirming a transfer of $58,000 that I had just sent to pay for his entire wedding. I stood in the silent kitchen. The late afternoon sunlight spilled through the window above the sink. It was the very window Sylvia, my wife, had insisted on installing. She wanted to look out at the rose bushes in the backyard while she cleaned. Now Sylvia was gone. It was just me, the steady ticking of the wall clock, and the receipt that was still warm from the printer. The phone on the table began to vibrate. It was Nadine, my future daughter-in-law. Her voice was syrupy sweet, the kind of sweetness that usually appeared whenever she needed another check. But today the tone was different. Colder. Calculated. Nadine started talking about symmetry, about the aesthetics of a perfect wedding. She explained that her parents were people of status, tall, elegant, perfectly matched in photographs, and me, a retired engineer with age spots on his hands. A man who, in her words, simply didn't fit the flawless image she had designed. She told me I wouldn't be allowed at the rehearsal dinner. Worse, I was being replaced in the role of walking my son down the aisle. The reason was simple photosymmetry. They had already found some distant uncle of hers to play the role of the perfect father. I tightened my grip on the receipt. My fingers trembled. As a mechanical engineer, I had spent 40 years designing structures built to bear weight. I understand stability. I know when a foundation begins to crack. But this fracture wasn't in a blueprint. It was inside my chest. A sharp pain cut through the quiet sacrifices of a father. I said nothing. My silence lasted so long, Nadine finally asked if I was still on the line. The silence of an engineer usually means he's evaluating the extent of the damage. $58,000. It wasn't just money. It was sweat. Sacrifice. The savings Sylvia and I had built over years so our son could have a good start in life. And yet somehow my presence had become a flaw in their wedding photographs. I looked down at my hands, thin, awkward hands. Joints worn from a lifetime spent building futures for other people. Nadine hung up after tossing out a shallow apology. The kitchen fell back into that terrifying silence. The receipt for $58,000 slipped from my fingers and landed alone on the cold stone countertop. Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Grab a glass of water, maybe a snack, sit back and get comfortable. And remember, everyone in these stories had every chance to do the right thing. They just chose not to. Leave a comment with the name of the city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story travels. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. I slowly sat down in my chair. My mind began running calculations. Not calculations about machines, calculations about justice. Because if they saw me as nothing more than a decorative piece that could be replaced, then they should also understand what it costs when the foundation is removed. I stared into the empty space. The chair across from me was still empty. It used to be Sylvia's seat. She would sit there every morning, a cup of coffee in her hand, her eyes resting on the backyard window. Sylvia always said this house was my greatest achievement. Not the bridges or highway systems I had designed, but the love I poured into every brick. In 1986, we got married with just $40 in our pockets. One promise. One cheap silver ring. We didn't need photosymmetry. We only needed each other. Sylvia stood beside me through the hardest years of poverty. She never once asked for a lavish wedding. All she wanted was a home that would stand strong. I remembered Gareth's face when he was little. He always ran to me whenever he fell. I was his safety net. Before Sylvia passed away, I promised her I would always protect him, that I would make sure he never had to suffer. I kept that promise blindly. I turned myself into a pillar that never complained. But now I realize I was wrong. I built his foundation too strong. So strong that he forgot who had been sweating underneath it all. Gareth is no longer the boy who needed my protection. He has become a stranger, a man willing to push his own father aside for the vanity of his future wife. What did Nadine do to my son? Or had Gareth always been this way? The questions drilled deeper and deeper into my mind. I stood up, my legs slightly unsteady. I walked to the sink and touched the wooden window frame Sylvia loved so much. The paint had begun to peel. Time spares nothing, not even loyalty between family. A deep emptiness settled inside me. $58,000 for the wedding. That number was just the final entry in a long ledger of being used. I remembered Gareth's phone calls. They always started the same way. "Dad, how are you?" And they always ended with a bill that needed paying. A new car, a luxury vacation, a credit card debt. I had been a terrible engineer in my own family. I ignored every warning sign of structural overload. I let love blur the real numbers. Sylvia had warned me once. She said Gareth was becoming too dependent, but I brushed it off. I wanted to make up for the loss of his mother. Now that compensation had become a blade, and it had been driven straight into this old heart. I looked at the receipt on the table. It was no longer a payment confirmation. It was evidence of my foolishness. I opened the cabinet drawer and took out my personal financial records. It was time for a mechanical engineer to conduct a full structural inspection. There would be no room for emotion in these calculations. If my presence held no value at the altar, then my money shouldn't be there either. I picked up a pencil and began drawing straight lines across the paper. Numbers started appearing. Clear, cold, merciless. I would give them the symmetry they wanted. The symmetry between what they received and what they deserved. Gareth had forgotten one fundamental law of physics. When you remove the main support column, the entire structure collapses. And I am that column. A column that has grown tired of carrying the weight for far too long. Tonight I will not sleep. Tonight I will calculate the price of betrayal. Cent by cent. I sat beneath the dim yellow glow of the desk lamp. Numbers began to dance across the paper. It was the habit of a mechanical engineer. When a machine breaks down, you dismantle it piece by piece. You find the fracture point. Tonight that machine was my life. I flipped through the bank transaction history from the past 3 years. A number at the bottom of the page made my breath catch. $97,000. That was the total amount I had spent on Gareth and Nadine. I stared at it. It wasn't just numbers. It was my lifespan. It was the overtime hours I worked while Sylvia was still alive. I began analyzing each entry. $45,000 for the down payment on their condominium. I thought it was the foundation of my son's happiness. $12,000 for Gareth's new car, because he said he needed reliable transportation to get to work. $1,100 for a plumbing repair bill last month. And then I remembered something. That was the same day Nadine posted photos of herself dining at the most expensive steakhouse in the city. They weren't fixing plumbing. They were spending my trust. Every line on the paper felt like another crack spreading through the structure. I turned to the page for the joint account I had opened for Gareth when he first entered college. That's when I noticed a new withdrawal. $5,000. No permission. No message. Not even a courtesy call. They had taken my money to prepare for a wedding where I wasn't even allowed to stand at the altar. Anger began flowing through my veins. Not the kind that shouts, the kind that feels like cold steel in winter. I realized something in that moment. To them I was not a father. I was an ATM machine that never ran out of cash. A safety net they could stomp on whenever they pleased. I remembered Nadine talking about photo symmetry. She worried about the aesthetic perfection of a wedding. But she didn't worry about who paid for every yard of lace on her wedding dress. She didn't care about the rough hands that signed those checks. I picked up my phone. My fingers moved calmly across the screen. I opened the banking app. It took only seconds. Lock the cards. Close the joint account. Cancel every automatic transfer. A strange sense of power ran through me. For the first time in years, I felt like I was controlling the load again. I was no longer a passive structure absorbing pressure. I was redesigning the entire system. I wondered how Gareth would react when his credit card was declined at the wedding florist. I wondered what Nadine would do when she realized the $58,000 wedding payment had never actually gone through. Because that transfer had been pending for 24 hours. And I had just pressed cancel. I leaned back in my chair. The pain in my chest was still there. But clarity had returned. In engineering, when a component stops functioning properly, you remove it. Gareth had chosen to remove my place at the altar. So I removed my place from their list of sponsors. Nadine's game of symmetry was about to begin. But she was about to learn the real meaning of balance between desire and the ability to pay for it herself. I looked at the final balance sheet one last time. $97,000. That was the price of my awakening. Far too expensive, but worth it. I switched off the desk lamp. Darkness filled the room. But this time I wasn't afraid. I was waiting. I knew the phone would ring soon. And this time, I would be the one setting the terms. Just as I expected, the phone began vibrating violently on the wooden table. The screen showed Gareth's name. I didn't rush to answer. I let it ring until the very last tone. Silence is a form of pressure. I learned that while testing material strength. The one who rushes, loses. I finally picked up. Chaos exploded through the speaker. Gareth was breathing hard. He was at the wedding suit shop. His card had been declined. The staff were staring at him with suspicion. He demanded to know what was going on. He shouted that this had to be some terrible mistake. I took a slow breath. My voice came out so calm it surprised even me. There's no mistake, I told him. I closed the account. And I canceled the transfer of $58,000. A dead silence followed on the line. Gareth stammered. Why? I repeated Nadine's favorite word. Symmetry. I told him that if I wasn't worthy enough to stand at the altar, then my money wasn't worthy enough to sit in the restaurant's bank account. Perfect symmetry. Exactly the way his fiancée wanted. Gareth's tone changed instantly. The pleading disappeared. What replaced it was a cowardly anger. He called me petty. Said I was ruining the most important day of his life because of my oversized ego. He used uglier words too. He said I was a terrible father. Terrible. I looked down at the list in front of me. $97,000. I asked him about the plumbing repair from last month. I asked about the car he was driving. I asked about the condominium I had helped build the foundation for. Gareth fell silent. He had no answers. Only attacks. He accused me of being selfish. Said money mattered more to me than the bond between father and son. I gave a quiet, painful laugh. I had spent 30 years proving the opposite. And what did it earn me? A revoked invitation. A cheap replacement in the one place I should have been proudest to stand. Then I heard Nadine's voice in the background. She was shouting at Gareth, talking about her family's reputation, talking about how their friends would laugh if the wedding collapsed. Not one of them asked how I felt. They were only worried about their perfect picture falling apart. Gareth made a threat. If you don't reopen the account, he said, I'll never speak to you again. I'll consider you gone. Just like Mom. That sentence hit like a brutal punch to the ribs. My chest tightened, but I didn't break. My voice turned cold. When a structure cracks too deeply, I said, you don't repair it with threats. If you're mature enough to remove your father from your wedding, then you're mature enough to pay for it yourself. And then I hung up. My hand was still shaking, but my heart had turned cold. I looked at Sylvia's photograph and whispered an apology. I couldn't protect the son we loved. Greed and selfishness had swallowed him whole. But I knew this was only the beginning. When parasites lose their source of nourishment, they become desperate. But I'm an engineer. I know how to build barriers. I know how to protect what remains of my life. I stood and walked to the window. Night had settled over the backyard. Sylvia's rose bushes trembled softly in the wind. And suddenly a thought crossed my mind. What if there were more secrets I didn't know? What if Sylvia had left something behind? Something I had overlooked all these years. I had a strange feeling. Somewhere in this house there was a truth waiting to be found. I stepped into the old bedroom. Sylvia's scent still lingered faintly on the curtains. I walked toward the oak wardrobe, the place where she kept the keepsakes I rarely touched. I needed answers. I needed to know just how blind I had been. At the bottom of a small wooden box lay a brown leather notebook. Sylvia's diary. Her neat slanted handwriting appeared under the beam of my flashlight. I began to read. Every page felt like a hammer striking the last piece of patience I had left. She had written about Nadine 4 years earlier when Gareth first brought her home. Sylvia had seen what I refused to see. She wrote that Nadine didn't look at Gareth with love in her eyes. She looked at this house. She looked at the expensive furniture. She looked at our savings account the way a hunter studies its prey. Sylvia had even written down a conversation she overheard by accident. Nadine told Gareth that I was nothing more than a tool. A way for them to reach a luxurious life without effort. And Gareth had stayed silent. He didn't defend me. He didn't defend his mother, who was already sick at the time. The pain tightened inside my chest. A brutal truth. Sylvia had known everything. She carried that burden alone because she didn't want me to collapse under it. She hoped time would change our son. But she was wrong. My tolerance only fed their greed. The final page of the diary stopped me cold. Sylvia had written it 1 week before she died. She begged me to stay awake, to stay clear-minded. She wrote that if there ever came a day when I felt I was no longer respected, I must stop. I must protect what was ours, and never allow them to drain the life out of me and discard me like an empty shell. I closed the diary. Hot tears rolled down my wrinkled cheeks. I had been too weak. I mistook submission for love. I allowed Gareth and Nadine to trample Sylvia's legacy. Just then a message arrived. From Gareth. It was a screenshot of a legal complaint. He threatened to sue me for violating a wedding sponsorship agreement. He demanded $25,000 in compensation for additional costs and for Nadine's emotional distress. I laughed through my tears. The son I raised was suing his own father, right after I had finished reading his mother's warnings. The irony was almost cruel. He wanted a war, fine. He wanted calculations like strangers. Then I would show him how a real engineer handles numbers. I looked into the mirror. For the first time tonight, I didn't see a pitiful old man abandoned by his family. I saw a man who had found his footing again. I would not stop at cutting off their funding. I would reclaim every dollar they had taken from me and Sylvia. A contract. In engineering, a contract becomes invalid the moment fraud exists in the foundation. And their marriage was the greatest fraud I had ever seen. I picked up the phone. It was time to call an old friend, attorney Gloria Harmon. I had thought the greatest pain was being pushed out of my son's wedding, but I was wrong. The real blow was still coming. I would tear off their masks in the very place where they planned to hold their extravagant ceremony. I left the bedroom. My steps were steadier now than they had been in years. I was no longer walking in the darkness of deception. I was moving toward the light of justice, a cold kind of justice, one that leaves no room for mercy. If you feel this story is heading in the right direction, leave a comment below saying I stand with Leonard. Your support is what keeps me uncovering the truth. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. The next morning the doorbell rang again and again. I opened the door. A man in a cheap suit handed me a yellow envelope. A lawsuit. Gareth had actually done it. He was suing his own father for violating a honeymoon agreement and wedding preparation costs. $25,000. That was the number he had placed on this betrayal. I stood frozen on the porch. The paper in my hands trembled not from fear but from disgust. A son suing his father because the money had stopped flowing into his vanity. This was the lowest form of decay I had ever witnessed. I called Gloria Harmon. She had been Sylvia's closest friend, a tough attorney with 30 years of experience in family law. We met at a small cafe. I placed Sylvia's diary and a copy of the lawsuit on the table. Gloria read slowly. Her eyebrows rose slightly. She looked at me with a mix of sympathy and sharp professional focus. This isn't just a civil dispute, she said. This is financial elder abuse. Cold legal words for a deeply immoral act. She began to break it down piece by piece. Gareth and Nadine had a calculated strategy. They took advantage of my emotional weakness after Sylvia died. They withdrew money from the joint account without consent for personal luxuries. They lied about home repairs to obtain cash. Gloria's voice became firm. We won't just defend ourselves, she said. We're going to counterattack. We would collect every piece of evidence showing the misuse of my funds, every message, every receipt, every debt I had unknowingly carried for them. A surge of energy ran through my spine. An engineer understands something simple. When a component fails completely, you don't repair it. You remove it to save the system. Gareth had become a failed component, corroded by Nadine's greed. Gloria told me to remain silent. No answering calls. No replying to messages. Let her handle everything. But my chest still tightened. I remembered Gareth as a boy. I taught him how to assemble model airplanes. I taught him that honesty was the foundation of every structure. Now he was using what I had given him as a weapon against me. He wanted $25,000. He would receive something far greater. He would receive the truth exposed in a courtroom. He would receive the lesson I had been too soft to teach him years ago. Then an email arrived from Nadine. She wrote that if I signed the check, she would persuade Gareth to withdraw the lawsuit. She called it a peaceful reconciliation. She still believed she held the leverage. She still believed I was a confused old man she could manipulate. I didn't respond. I deleted the email immediately. Outside the cafe window, the city moved on as usual. But inside me, there was a terrifying calm. The calm before the greatest storm of my life. I stepped outside. Cold wind pushed against my coat. I once thought the worst pain was being thrown out of my son's wedding. I was wrong. The real blow was still ahead. A courtroom battle where family love would be weighed and measured like numbers on a ledger. And I was ready. For Sylvia. And for my own dignity. I returned home and began gathering documents, blueprints, bank statements, receipts, every number. Gareth had forgotten one important thing. I am an engineer, and I never build anything without a backup plan. My backup plan was about to become their worst nightmare. Gloria's office sat on the top floor of an old building. The air carried the heavy smell of aged paper and printer ink. She looked at me over a pair of silver-rimmed glasses. Gloria didn't comfort me with empty words. Instead, she asked a cold question. "Leonard, do you want to get everything back?" I nodded. It was no longer about money. It was about the integrity of a lifetime of honest work. Gloria opened the financial file I had prepared. She took a yellow highlighter and began marking lines. Bright streaks appeared across the pages like wounds. She pointed at the $1,100 plumbing repair. Then she placed another document beside it. "This," she said, "is a receipt from a luxury spa on the exact same day." Nadine had used the excuse of home repairs to pay for beauty treatments. Next came Gareth's credit card debt. $15,000 for a golf trip in Florida that he had claimed was a business trip. Gloria's voice sharpened. "This is systematic asset exploitation." She called it financial elder abuse. The phrase tasted bitter in my ears. I had never thought of myself as a victim. I believed I was simply a generous father. But Gloria stripped the illusion away. I had been a hostage to my own kindness. She began outlining the strategy. "We won't just dismiss Gareth's lawsuit," she said. "We will countersue. We would demand the return of the condominium down payment. We would demand repayment for the car. And we would ask the court to freeze their assets to guarantee enforcement." A chill ran down my spine. If we did this, Gareth would lose everything. No apartment, no car, and certainly no wedding. Part of me hesitated. He was still my son. He carried Sylvia's blood. Gloria seemed to read my thoughts. She placed her hand firmly on the file. "Leonard," she said quietly, "remember his face when he told you that you didn't belong at the altar. Remember the $25,000 lawsuit he sent you this morning. He stopped seeing you as his father a long time ago." I closed my eyes. I saw Gareth standing beside Nadine. Their expressions were calculating. No regret, only greed. I opened my eyes again. The hesitation was gone. "Proceed," I told Gloria. "Don't hold back." She smiled. It was the smile of a hunter who had finally spotted the prey. Gloria told me she had already hired a private investigator. We needed proof that Nadine had planned this from the beginning. Hidden conversations. Quiet agreements. I left the law office. The city below looked small from that height. My life felt small too. I had spent too many years building structures for other people. I had forgotten to protect the foundation of my own life. The counterclaim would be filed tomorrow morning. Gareth would receive it while trying on his expensive wedding suit. I wanted him to understand the feeling of a structure collapsing without warning. No alarms, no escape. I went home and started cleaning. I packed Gareth's old belongings into cardboard boxes. I would no longer keep them where I could see them. I needed space to breathe. I needed a new beginning. But I knew Gareth wouldn't stay silent. He would fight like a cornered animal. And I was ready. I was no longer a weak old father. I was an engineer repairing a catastrophic system failure. A system failure named my only son. Early on the morning of the wedding, I put on my best suit. The suit I had bought specifically for the day I would walk Gareth down the aisle. I wasn't going there to beg for forgiveness. I was going to perform one final inspection. The lobby of the five-star hotel was thick with the scent of lilies and luxury. I stood outside the bridal suite entrance, Two security guards looked at me with polite pity. They told me my name was not on the guest list. They said the bride had requested that I leave. Gareth stepped out. He was wearing the custom suit I had paid the first installment for. His face twisted with anger. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. He called me a saboteur. He said I had humiliated him in front of Nadine's family by filing the counterclaim. Nadine appeared right behind him. She was radiant in a white lace wedding dress, but her eyes were full of poison. She called me a crazy old man. She threatened to call the police if I took another step. She said my presence would stain their perfect day. I looked directly into my son's eyes. I asked him only one question. "Gareth, do you really want this?" He didn't answer. He only shouted for me to leave. He said I was no longer his father. He said my love had always been cheap control. The pain in my chest suddenly disappeared. In its place was a perfect emptiness, like a steel beam finally snapping after years of carrying too much weight. The structure had completely collapsed. There was nothing left here to repair. I stepped back. Then I pulled out a small envelope. I didn't hand it to Gareth. I gave it to the security guard. "Please give this to the groom after I leave," I said. Inside was documentation showing that their condominium had been legally frozen. It was also the notice for the repossession of the car later that afternoon. Nadine laughed. She thought I was bluffing. She believed her power was permanent. She didn't know how efficiently Gloria had been working. She didn't know that the luxury surrounding her was nothing more than a castle built on sand. I turned and walked away. Inside the ballroom, orchestral music began to rise. The laughter of wealthy guests drowned out the sound of my footsteps. I walked out of the hotel into the bright sunlight. I sat in my car and looked into the rearview mirror. Gareth was standing at the entrance. He was staring at me with confusion on his face. Perhaps he had finally begun to feel the shaking beneath the foundation. But it was too late for reinforcement. My silence over the past days had been technical preparation. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I simply removed the financial supports they had always relied on. If they wanted a wedding built on photo-symmetry, then they would receive a reality perfectly symmetrical to their actions. I drove away. I didn't go home. I drove to the cemetery. I needed to speak with Sylvia. I needed to tell her that I had followed her advice. I had drawn the boundary. I had found myself again in the ruins of a broken family. The court battle would take place next week. But for me, the war ended at the doorway of that hotel. I had seen the truth. And the truth had freed me from the chains of meaningless sacrifice. If you followed the story all the way here, then it must have held your interest. So here's a small and quick favor, press subscribe. Many people watch without doing it, but it costs nothing and means a great deal to us. I took a deep breath. The air filled my lungs. For the first time in years, I didn't feel heavy. I didn't feel anxious. I only felt the freedom of a man who had nothing left to lose. The wedding would continue. But their future would not. A new chapter of my life was beginning. Without Gareth. Without Nadine. Just me. And the hard lessons that finally set me free. The courtroom felt cold. The scent of polished wood and solemn silence filled the air. I sat on the left side of the room. Gloria Harmon was beside me, organizing thick stacks of documents. Across the aisle sat Gareth and Nadine. Gareth no longer wore the elegant suit from the wedding day. He looked pale and worn out. Nadine sat next to him, gripping her designer handbag as if it were the last thing she still controlled. Nadine began with a performance worthy of a stage. She sniffled before the judge, speaking about emotional suffering. She described me as a bitter father who had ruined the happiest day of their lives. She demanded $25,000 in damages for breaking my promise to fund their wedding. She played the victim beautifully. But she forgot one important thing. Judges do not rule based on tears. They rule based on evidence. Gloria stood. She didn't use dramatic language. She simply presented numbers. Cold, undeniable numbers. $97,000 over the past 3 years. She exposed every fraudulent expense. The plumbing repair that was actually a spa bill. The work equipment purchase that turned out to be a luxury vacation. The decisive blow came when Stewart entered the courtroom. He was Gareth's old friend, and once my assistant. In his hands was a folder containing voice recordings and text messages. Gareth had accidentally sent part of a conversation to an old group chat. In the recording, Nadine laughed about draining my accounts after the wedding and moving into a new apartment under her name alone. Gareth had replied with a simple approval emoji. Silence spread through the courtroom. I looked at my son. His head hung low. There was no remorse in his face, only the humiliation of being caught. I asked permission to speak. I stood up. My hands were no longer shaking. I looked directly at the judge. I spoke the way an engineer would. Your Honor, I said in construction, we call this material fatigue. I carried the load of love for many years. But this is not a child asking for support. This is calculated exploitation disguised as family. I did not violate any contract, because a contract built on deception at its foundation never truly exists. The judge turned to Gareth. Do you have anything to say? He stammered. Then he tried to blame Nadine. He claimed she had pressured him. Nadine shot him a look filled with disgust. The perfect photosymmetry they once dreamed of had turned into a fracture exploding right before everyone's eyes. The ruling came shortly after. The judge dismissed Gareth's lawsuit entirely. She declared the situation a clear case of financial elder abuse. Gareth was ordered to repay the full apartment deposit and my legal fees. The court also instructed Adult Protective Services to investigate additional financial exploitation. Gareth collapsed back into his chair. Nadine stood abruptly and walked out of the courtroom without even looking at him. I looked at my son one last time. I felt no triumph, only the sight of a structure completely destroyed, a ruin that could never be rebuilt. I walked out of the courthouse. Gloria shook my hand and told me it was finally over. But I knew something every engineer understands. Demolition is not the hardest part. Rebuilding from the ashes is. I took a deep breath. The air outside the courthouse felt clean. For the first time in years, I owed nothing to anyone, and no one could take anything more from me. Justice had been served, but the price was a family, gone forever. I decided to sell the old house. There were too many ghosts of betrayal living in those walls. I moved into a small apartment overlooking the river. The space was simple and filled with light. Most of my time now was spent in a small woodworking shop in the basement. The sound of the saw and the scent of fresh pine helped me find my calm again. I was no longer calculating thousands of dollars. Now I measured the precision of each wood joint. Nadine left immediately after the court ruling. She could not survive without my checks. She took what little luxury remained and abandoned Gareth with a mountain of debt. Their condominium was repossessed. The car was taken back. Gareth was left with nothing. No money, no status, no family. One night at 2 a.m, my phone vibrated. It was Gareth. He was crying. His voice broke between sobs and the thick smell of alcohol. He said he was sorry. He said Nadine had manipulated him. He begged me to give him a chance to come back. He promised he would start over. He said he had nowhere left to go. I listened in silence. My heart no longer tightened the way it once did. The load I had carried for years had already reached its breaking point. Now it had simply hardened. I told him the door of my home would never close to my son. But my son had disappeared from my life on the day of that wedding. The man speaking to me now was only a stranger learning to face the consequences of his choices. I did not give him money. I gave him an address. A woodworking shop outside the city. If he truly wanted to start again, he would have to begin with labor. He would have to learn how to build something with his own sweat instead of draining it from others. 1 month later, Gareth appeared at my door. He looked thinner. The hands that once signed checks were now covered in calluses and small cuts. He asked if he could help me build a bookshelf for the living room. I handed him a hand plane. He worked clumsily. He mismeasured boards. He ruined a few pieces of good wood. But for the first time I saw persistence in him. He did not complain. He did not demand anything. He simply bent down and quietly gathered the wood shavings from the floor. Forgiveness is a complicated form of engineering. You cannot simply cover the cracks. You must dismantle the rotten pieces and rebuild the structure properly. Gareth and I are only at the first step of that process. We no longer talk about money. We talk about wood grain, about balance, about how a structure holds its weight. Watching my son struggle with the sanding machine, I realized something. My greatest mistake had not been giving him money. It was failing to teach him how to stand on his own feet. I had built him such a wide safety net that he forgot how to fly. My new life is quiet. Each afternoon I sit on the balcony and watch the river flow past. I no longer feel lonely. Somewhere I believe Sylvia is smiling. I protected the foundation of my own life. If any part of this story feels familiar to you, if you feel that people only need you but never truly respect you, then listen carefully. You are allowed to stop. Setting boundaries is not cruelty. Sometimes it is the only way to discover who truly cares about you. My story may not end with great wealth or a perfectly reunited family. But I have freedom. Gareth has a chance to become a real man. And that is the final balance sheet I am most satisfied with. Thank you for following Leonard's journey toward justice here on Dad's Real Life Revenge. Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next hard-earned lessons. See you in the next story. 6 months ago, I walked into a dining room filled with excitement and pride because my daughter had come home. But before that night was over, in a single moment, I realized that the child I had raised and protected for 36 years, Sienna, was sitting across from me with the intention of harming me for money. Welcome back to Dad's Real Life Revenge. I'm Sterling Vance. Grab a drink, some snacks, get comfortable. And remember this, the people in these stories had every opportunity to do the right thing, they simply chose not to. Leave a comment with the number 1 so we can continue the story, and subscribe, you're going to enjoy this one. $68 million. That was the exact amount sitting in my trust account. It was the price of 42 years spent fighting my way through the business world. And what did I get in return? A calculating look from my own daughter. Cordelia, my devoted wife, had been gone for less than 100 days. Her ashes rested in Lake Norman Cemetery, and the ground above them had barely settled. Yet our only daughter had already scripted a fateful dinner. Sienna walked into the house wearing an elegant black dress. She smiled. The smile was exactly like Cordelia's, but her eyes were completely empty. When had greed begun to hollow out her soul? The contrast tightened my chest. I had spent my entire life shielding her from every storm. I gave her black cards with no spending limit. I bought her the finest luxury apartment downtown when she wanted to move out on her own. I had believed that the bond between father and daughter was something beyond value. But to Sienna, this father's life was worth nothing more than the lifeless numbers written on the pages of a will. The familiar dining room suddenly felt suffocating. The faint scent of candles could not hide the smell of the betrayal that was about to unfold. The clinking of silverware against porcelain echoed with a dry, hollow sound. I watched my beloved daughter place food onto my plate. Her hand trembled slightly. An unusual touch of her handbag. The instincts of a businessman who had survived hundreds of major deals told me that something was wrong. My intuition had never failed me. The outrage rose into my throat as I realized the bitter truth. The child who once cried hysterically when she saw me cut my hand was now calmly staring at her father's glass of wine with a dark scheme in mind. I took a deep breath. This fight for survival had only just begun. I stared at the glass of deep red wine on the table. The light from the chandelier reflected off its still surface. It shimmered with an eerie glow. My mind drifted back 42 years. Back then, my entire fortune consisted of an old pickup truck and a head full of ambition. I drove that truck through freezing winter nights. I slept at roadside rest stops along the highway. This body had been pushed beyond its limits more times than I could count, just to lay the first brick of what would become today's logistics empire. Through all those stormy years, Cordelia was always by my side. She shared dry loaves of bread with me. She stayed awake through countless nights, helping me count every small order. We built this empire with sweat, tears, and blood. When Sienna was born, I swore that my daughter would never have to endure even a fraction of the hardship we had faced. I wanted her to live the life of a princess. But I was wrong. Unlimited indulgence had raised a monster. Ever since Cordelia died, half of my world had collapsed. The other half was the irreparable fracture between Sienna and me. I tried to make up for it. I tried to talk to her, but every time we faced each other, all I saw was a wall of ice. The wooden bridge connecting father and daughter was cracking a little more each day under the weight of greed. She did not want my love. She wanted the enormous fortune under my control. She looked at the chairman's seat of the corporation like a starving tiger stalking its prey. I looked directly into Sienna's eyes. She quickly looked away and adjusted her collar. The silence surrounding the wine glass between us felt like a death sentence hanging in the air. I already knew what her next move would be. This betrayal was more than a slap in my face. It was a desecration of Cordelia's memory. I reached for the wedding ring on my finger. Fury and heartbreak merged into a single emotion. Tonight, at this very dining table, I would have to face an enemy I once called my daughter. But Sienna was not acting alone. The shadow behind her had finally stepped into the light. A familiar set of footsteps echoed from the dining room entrance. The man who walked in wore a smile that was far too perfect, a smile that sent a chill down my spine. Gideon Cross. My son-in-law walked into the room. He was wearing an expensive custom-tailored suit paid for with the very money I had earned through blood and sweat. His appearance was always so polished that it felt artificial. His hair was perfectly groomed. The smile on his lips was flawless. So flawless that it made people uneasy. He walked over to Sienna and placed a hand on her shoulder. A gesture of complicity. He bowed his head toward me with his usual respectful tone, but his eyes were filled with hunger. I knew exactly what lay beneath that polished exterior. Gideon was nothing more than a complete failure hiding behind the image of a businessman. 3 years earlier, he had burned through $2 million in a fraudulent real estate project. I had been forced to clean up the disaster to save my daughter from embarrassment. A year later, he managed to make another $5 million disappear in the cryptocurrency market. He was addicted to alcohol and drowning in enormous debts. Every time he failed, I was the one signing checks worth millions of dollars to rescue his hollow reputation. He saw me as a bottomless cash machine. But today my alcoholic son-in-law was behaving unusually well. He declined the glass of premium wine I offered him. Instead, he poured himself a glass of water. He said he was cleansing his body in preparation for a new project. My suspicions immediately rose to their highest level. A starving wolf does not suddenly refuse a good meal. It only means that it has set its sights on prey far larger. My life, the atmosphere around the dinner table grew thick and heavy. Gideon's arrival made the purpose of this dinner clearer than ever. He kept glancing at the Patek Philippe watch on his wrist. He was counting the minutes. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my chest. Bitterness rose in my throat. The daughter I loved most had chosen to stand beside this broken man against her own father. Gideon began pouring water into his glass. His eyes shifted toward Sienna. He gave a slight nod. A silent signal had been sent. I clenched my fist beneath the oak table. They thought I was a confused old man who could be led around by the nose, but they had forgotten who I was. I watched every one of Sienna's movements with absolute focus. Her hand drifted once again toward the expensive handbag beside her. The same action, repeated over and over, almost obsessively. Sienna's nervousness had gone far beyond her ability to control it. Around the dinner table, the occasional clink of silverware sounded strangely out of rhythm. I was not watching her eyes. I was watching those trembling hands. The counting discipline I had developed as a businessman allowed me to record everything with precision. The fourth time, she lightly tapped the strap of her crocodile leather Chanel handbag. The seventh time, she pretended to bend down and adjust the position of the bag beneath her chair. Then came the 11th time, her eyes fixed on the gold-plated clasp of the handbag. 11 touches in less than 15 minutes. For a man who had conducted thousands of negotiations, that was not an unconscious habit. It was the behavior of someone hiding a crime. The atmosphere in the dining room had become thick with pretense. Every now and then Gideon would tell a dull joke about the stock market. He laughed by himself. Sienna forced a polite smile in response. Her face looked pale beneath the chandelier light. Beads of sweat dotted her forehead even though the air conditioner was set to 20 degrees Celsius. Pain tore through me. The daughter I had once carried in my arms. The child I had stayed awake all night caring for whenever she had a high fever. Now she sat barely a meter away from me, counting down the moments until her father entered eternity. The silence surrounding the glass of red wine before me felt like a deadly trap. I maintained the calm expression of the chairman of a leading logistics corporation. I smiled and nodded at Gideon's flattery. But beneath the oak table, my fingers were clenched so tightly that they had turned white. My instincts rose stronger than ever. I could smell betrayal. I could see the cracks spreading across the wooden bridge of family devotion. Frustration and fury climbed into my throat, but I forced them back down. I needed proof. I needed to know exactly how they intended to strike. Suddenly, Sienna stood up. She said she needed to use the restroom to touch up her makeup. She carried the handbag with her, holding it possessively. Gideon remained at the table. He looked at me with a mysterious expression. Then he nudged my wine glass about 2 centimeters across the table. At that exact moment, the kitchen door opened slightly. A young waiter stepped out carrying a tray of fresh dishes. His eyes were not on the food. They were fixed directly on me. Filled with absolute panic, he was trying to send me a message with nothing but his eyes. A desperate warning. An urgent plea for help. My phone vibrated inside the pocket of my suit jacket. It was a call from the corporation's chief financial officer. I excused myself to Gideon and stepped out onto the nearby balcony. On the other end of the line, he confirmed a critical piece of information. The largest merger of the year had been completed. $68 million had officially been transferred into my secure personal account. An enormous sum. The crowning achievement of my business career, yet at that moment it brought me nothing but a chilling sense of dread. I ended the call and returned to the dining room. Sienna had not yet come back from the restroom. Gideon had temporarily left the table to take another phone call near the main foyer. At that moment, only Silas remained in the dining room with me, the young waiter who had just delivered the food tray. He approached to clear away the used plates. His hands were trembling uncontrollably. The porcelain dishes clattered softly against one another. Silas lowered his head. Pretending to wipe down the table, he leaned close to my ear. His voice was barely above a whisper, only loud enough for the two of us to hear. "Sir, while you were on the phone, your daughter put something into your wine." I froze. Shh. My heart pounded violently. The blood in my veins seemed to turn to ice. Silas's words struck me like a fatal knife driven straight into my chest. Pain tore through my soul. The brutal truth had been exposed in its rawest form. My own daughter truly wanted me dead. Silas looked up at me with frightened but determined eyes. He continued speaking quickly. He told me that his uncle had once worked for a wealthy family. His uncle had witnessed a similar poisoning scheme, but he had remained silent and spent the rest of his life haunted by regret. Silas did not want to watch that tragedy happen again. He swore that what he had seen through the crack of the kitchen door was completely real. I stared at the glass of dark red wine. It sat silently on the table like an invisible death sentence. The chandelier's light reflected through the liquid, giving it an unusual violet tint. The greed of Sienna and Gideon had transformed a celebratory drink into a poisoned cup meant to end a blood bond between father and daughter. 42 years in the business world had never prepared me for a nightmare like this. I took a deep breath to keep myself from falling apart. A surge of outrage and fury rose inside the 68-year-old man I had become. Footsteps echoed from the hallway. Sienna was returning. At the same time, Gideon ended his call and walked back into the room, a trace of triumph hidden behind his smile. They looked at me. They looked at the poisoned wine. The deception had reached its peak. I had to make a decision immediately. Confront them and expose everything, or remain silent and set a trap of my own. Time was now measured in seconds. I picked up the wine glass. My hand did not tremble. I looked directly into my daughter's tense eyes. And in that instant, a bold plan for a switch flashed through my mind. Sienna sat back down in her chair. She stared at my wine glass. Gideon had also returned to his seat. The familiar, flawless smile spread across his face. A brutal internal battle raged inside my mind. I wanted to jump to my feet. I wanted to throw that poisoned glass of wine directly into their faces. I wanted to scream and ask why the daughter I had raised for 36 years could be so cold-blooded. But the composure of a seasoned businessman stopped me. If I confronted them now, they would deny everything. They would destroy the evidence. I needed a perfect revenge. I needed them to bring down this performance with their own hands. I set the wine glass back on the table. Then I glanced towards Silas, who stood tensely in the corner of the room. I gave him a quick wink. Silas was surprisingly intelligent. He understood immediately. Carrying a tray of hot soup, he approached the dining table. Then he deliberately caught his foot on the edge of the oak table. A loud crash echoed through the room. The metal tray and 2 bowls of soup spilled onto the floor beside Gideon's chair. Hot soup splashed across Gideon's trousers. He jumped to his feet and began shouting curses. Sienna immediately turned toward him in alarm and helped him up while trying to clean the stain. For 5 seconds, both of them were completely distracted. 5 seconds that would define the course of my life. My 68-year-old hands moved with the speed of a master magician. Smooth, silent, invisible. I switched my wine glass with Sienna's. The two glasses were identical, but now the deadly liquid sat in front of my ungrateful daughter. The safe glass was in my possession. I withdrew my hand and adjusted the collar of my suit. Everything happened in an instant. Without the slightest sound, the illusion surrounding the wine glasses remained perfectly intact. After cleaning himself up, Gideon sat down again with an irritated expression. He shot Silas a razor-sharp glare. Silas lowered his head and mumbled an apology before quickly cleaning up the mess and retreating to the kitchen. The dining room returned to its earlier silence. But the balance of power had completely changed. The counter-trap had been set. Sienna let out a quiet breath of relief. She turned toward me. Her face struggled to regain its artificial cheerfulness. Then she picked up her wine glass. The poisoned wine now rested in her trembling hand. She raised the glass toward me. Gideon immediately lifted his own glass of water. I smiled, a cold smile filled with absolute contempt. Neither of them had any idea that disaster was now calling my daughter's name. Sienna began to speak. Her voice echoed through the suffocating room. The most horrifying chapter of this dinner had officially begun. Sienna raised her wine glass toward me. She smiled, a smile of deception brought to its absolute peak. She congratulated her father on the successful completion of the $68 million deal. She said she wanted to toast to a new beginning for our family after the loss of her mother, Cordelia. The words coming from my own daughter's mouth sounded sweet, yet they were as sharp and cold as blades stabbing into my heart. Sitting beside her, Gideon also raised his glass of water. His eyes sparkled with triumph. He believed the plan was perfect. He believed he was about to become the owner of an enormous fortune. I looked directly into Sienna's eyes. I raised my own safe glass of wine. I nodded slightly. I thanked them for this special dinner. I told them I would never forget this night. Sienna suspected nothing. She lifted the glass to her lips. She took a large sip. Then she drained it completely. The deadly liquid slid smoothly down her throat. I also took a sip from my own wine. Then I calmly set the glass down on the oak table. If you've followed the story this far, I'm sure it has stirred some emotions in you. Please help us with one small favor that only takes a moment. Like and subscribe. Leave a comment with the number 5 so I know you've made it this far, and tell me your prediction for how the story will end to see if you're right. Many people watch without doing that, but it costs you nothing and means a great deal to us. Everything happened so quickly. Gideon stared at me. The perfect smile on his lips suddenly froze. He waited. He waited for me to collapse. He waited for me to clutch my chest in agony. But 5 seconds passed. 10 seconds passed. I was still sitting there. I was still looking at him with a terrifying silence. The change in Gideon's expression was incredibly satisfying. His eyes widened in horror. He looked at my empty wine glass. Then he looked at Sienna's glass. Utter confusion was written across the face of the scheming man. At that exact moment, Sienna dropped her glass. The glass shattered across the floor. The sharp crash shattered the suffocating atmosphere. Sienna brought both hands to her throat. Her face twisted in pain. She could not breathe. Her eyes looked at me in complete panic. Her body began to convulse violently. She collapsed onto the dining table, sending dishes and plates crashing to the floor. The poison spread far too quickly. It was far more powerful than I could ever have imagined. Gideon rushed toward Sienna and grabbed her. For the first time, he appeared genuinely panicked, but he was not worried about his wife's life. He was terrified because the plan had gone completely wrong. He looked at me with the eyes of an animal trapped with nowhere left to run. Gideon's screams echoed throughout the suffocating dining room. The fateful dinner had turned into a scene filled with blood and tears. Retribution had arrived far sooner than expected, but the true cruelty hidden behind my son-in-law's mask would not be fully revealed until the minutes that followed. Gideon frantically shook Sienna's shoulders. She had completely lost consciousness. Foam gathered around her mouth. Her eyes stared blankly at the ceiling. The sight should have shattered the heart of any father, but my heart felt as cold as ashes. I stood silently at the head of the dining table. I looked at my son-in-law with the eyes of a judge observing a condemned man. Gideon's panic reached its peak. He pulled out his phone. His fingers were trembling so badly that he entered the wrong passcode 3 times, but he did not dial emergency services. He called an unknown number instead. In a furious whisper, he said that the plan had failed and that the poison had gone to the wrong person. The moment he noticed me approaching, he ended the call. The most infuriating moment came when I reached for my phone to call an ambulance. Gideon lunged forward. He slapped the phone from my hand. It crashed onto the floor, the screen shattering instantly. He stepped in front of me, his face twisted into the savage expression of a monster. He shouted that no one was allowed to call anybody. He was afraid the police would arrive. He was afraid doctors would discover the specialized poison he had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars obtaining through the underworld. He was willing to let Sienna slowly die on the dining table if it meant saving his own worthless skin. Disgust rose into my throat. This man possessed not a shred of humanity. He was willing to step over his own wife's body to protect himself. But he had made one fatal mistake. Silas had been standing at the dining room entrance for some time, holding a phone that was actively recording, and from outside the distant sound of ambulance, sirens, and police vehicles was already growing louder. I had called them before I ever sat down at this dinner table. 10 minutes later, the emergency team rushed into the room. They placed Sienna onto a stretcher and immediately began resuscitation efforts. The lead physician looked at the spilled wine on the table. He collected a sample of the liquid and examined it. His expression changed instantly. He looked directly at Gideon before turning to the police officers who had just entered the room. The doctor stated with certainty that the quantity of poison involved was far too large to be accidental. This was an intentional attempted murder. Gideon stepped backward. His back struck the cold wall. He looked around the room and finally realized that the trap had completely closed around him. But evil people always have one last desperate move. As the officers approached, Gideon suddenly pointed straight at me. He shouted at the top of his lungs, accusing me of something horrifying, a false accusation that had the potential to turn the entire investigation upside down. Gideon pointed directly at me. He shouted at the police that I was the one who had poisoned my own daughter. He accused me of wanting to keep the entire $68 million for myself, and claimed that I had committed a cruel and ruthless act. Tears appeared on command. He played the role of a grieving husband who was about to lose his wife. The officers immediately turned their attention toward me with suspicion in their eyes. My silence only made them more cautious. But I was not worried. A seasoned businessman never enters a battle without preparing his weapons first. I gave a slight nod toward Silas. The young waiter stepped forward and handed his phone, still playing the recording, to the lead detective. Gideon's shouting in the dining room echoed clearly through the audio. The recording proved that he had tried to prevent anyone from calling for emergency help. It proved that he knew about the poison. The color instantly drained from Gideon's face. At that exact moment, a team of private investigators I had hired earlier entered the room. They carried a thick stack of documents. Justice was finally beginning to unfold in a deeply satisfying way. They presented evidence that Gideon could not deny. For months, he had secretly monitored my financial accounts. Most damning of all was a forged draft of my will bearing a counterfeit version of my signature. According to that document, if I died, my entire estate would transfer directly to Sienna. Immediately afterward, Gideon would gain full control over everything. An even more horrifying truth emerged when investigators examined Gideon's finances. He was carrying gambling debts totaling $400,000 with underground casinos. Every one of those debts had been signed in Sienna's name without her knowledge. He had pushed my daughter into a corner. He had turned her into an accomplice in a plan to kill her father in exchange for money to erase his debts. Pain and disgust rose to unbearable levels inside me. The daughter I had raised for 36 years had been manipulated by this broken man until she had lost all sense of humanity. The police immediately escorted Gideon to the hospital where Sienna was receiving emergency treatment so they could continue questioning him. There, in the hospital corridor, the psychological pressure finally shattered him. When a doctor informed him that Sienna might spend the rest of her life in a vegetative state, Gideon made a fatal mistake. In front of detectives, he shouted a single sentence. She wasn't supposed to drink that wine. That statement was the clearest confession possible. He had admitted that the wine had originally been intended for me. The most satisfying moment had finally arrived. The lead detective needed no further evidence. He pulled out a pair of handcuffs. A sharp metallic click echoed through the hallway. Gideon's wrists were locked together on the spot. He collapsed to his knees on the cold hospital floor. The punishment he deserved was now waiting for him. But this story could not end there. As the first light of dawn slowly appeared on the horizon, I still had one final truth to face. Would my daughter wake up and live long enough to hear the final judgment from her father? Gideon Cross was sentenced to 27 years in prison without parole. It was a fitting price for his greed and cold-blooded cruelty. Sienna was fortunate to survive thanks to the doctor's timely intervention. But her brain suffered severe damage. She would spend the rest of her life confined to a wheelchair. Pain tears through my heart every time I look at my only daughter, who was once born with every advantage, now living with a permanent disability. But justice is justice. Betrayal always comes with a very high price. I did not abandon her. I established a conditional trust fund through a bank. The money is sufficient only to cover her medical expenses and professional care for the rest of her life. She will never again have access to a single dollar of that $68 million fortune. As for Silas, the kind-hearted waiter, I paid for his entire college education so he could fulfill his dream of earning a degree. He deserved a bright future after the quiet act of courage he showed that night. I stood alone on the balcony of my home overlooking Lake Norman. The first light of dawn was slowly breaking across the horizon. The lake's surface was calm and crystal clear, like a mirror reflecting my life back at me. 42 years of struggle in the business world had brought me success and wealth. Yet in the end, what remained was a cold dining room and a shattered family. Money does not destroy families. It merely reveals the truth that was already hidden inside them. Human greed is a bottomless abyss. If we fail to control it, it will consume everything we hold sacred. Sienna's betrayal left a deep scar on my heart, but I chose to face it and move forward. Overcoming betrayal is not about revenge. It is about refusing to let darkness become the final chapter of your life. This story is a reminder of the power of kindness between strangers. If you found value in it, please share it and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next awakening truth. Thank you for listening to my story. Cherish the people beside you before greed blinds them. Goodbye, and I will see you again. On Christmas Eve, my only son told me the best gift I could give them was my absence. I did not argue. I quietly paid off the house, secretly sold it, and boarded a one-way flight to Florida. Michigan was 18 degrees that night. But the cold outside was nothing compared to the atmosphere inside my son's living room. A massive Christmas tree shimmered with expensive gold ornaments. Beneath it sat luxury gifts wrapped in silk ribbons. I sat quietly in a leather armchair. My rough mechanic's hands curled around a cup of cold ginger tea, searching for warmth that was no longer there. Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Grab a drink, a few snacks, get comfortable, and remember this: everyone in these stories had every chance to do the right thing. They simply chose wrong. Subscribe and leave comment number 1 if you want to hear this story all the way to the end. Across from me sat Ethan, my only son, and his wife Sarah. Ethan wore an expensive cashmere sweater while casually swirling a glass of red wine. He never looked at me. His eyes stayed glued to his iPad as his fingers moved across the screen. I cleared my throat, trying to break the silence crushing my chest. I told him I heard his tech company had been struggling with cash flow. I said I still had some savings. Around $25,000. If he needed it, I would gladly give it to him. Ethan cut me off before I could finish. He never even looked up. He said my $25,000 meant nothing in his industry. It would barely cover 2 employees for a week. He told me to keep it for myself. The words hit harder than the winter air outside. My hand trembled slightly. Tea spilled onto the saucer. Then Sarah smirked. It was small, almost invisible. But I saw it. She turned to Ethan with a syrupy voice coated in poison. She said, "If Dad wants to help, you should accept it." Then she looked directly at me. She explained that this Christmas they were taking the children skiing in Aspen with Ethan's business partners. Space would be limited. Everyone there would be wealthy people from the upper business world. That was when Ethan finally looked up, but not at me. He stared at the wall behind my shoulder and slammed his wine glass onto the table with a sharp crack. In a flat, emotionless voice, he told me I was old. My world was bolts and engine grease. His world was algorithms and million-dollar deals. He said my presence at his parties only embarrassed him. I stared at my son. The little boy who once cried and begged me to hold him during thunderstorms now stood before me as a polished stranger. Tall, successful, cold. I did not fight back. I chose silence instead. I stood up, put on my worn-out coat, and quietly walked toward the door. Nobody followed me. Nobody said goodbye. When the heavy wooden door closed behind me, I stood alone beneath the falling snow. That was the moment I made my decision. They wanted my absence. Fine. They were about to get it in a way they never expected. I drove my 2012 Ford F-150 through the snow-covered roads toward home. The windshield wipers squeaked steadily through the dark night. My mind drifted through 40 years of memories. When my wife died from illness, Ethan was only 7 years old. I stood before her photograph and made a promise. I swore I would give our son the best life possible. I was just a grease-stained mechanic with smoke-soaked hands. But my son would walk into school wearing clean, white shirts. To pay for Ethan's private school education, I worked 2 jobs every single day. In the mornings, I worked at the repair shop. At night, I hauled freight at a shipping warehouse. I slept less than 4 hours a day. My hands were covered with scars from engine burns and sliced metal. My joints ached whenever the weather changed. Every sacrifice was for Ethan. When he graduated from college, these rough hands signed an $80,000 check to pay off the rest of his student loans. And when he married Sarah and wanted that beautiful 4-bedroom house in an upscale Michigan neighborhood, I never hesitated. I emptied my retirement fund and handed them $200,000 for the down payment. In total, I poured more than $800,000 into my son's life. I never asked for a single dollar in return. I only wanted a home, a place where I belonged when I grew old. But money and success in the tech industry changed Ethan. It changed him faster than a Michigan winter storm rolling in overnight. Last year, during their housewarming party, Ethan introduced me to his friends. He smiled and said, "This is Uncle Jack, an old family friend visiting from down south." Uncle Jack. I stood frozen in the middle of their luxurious living room, still holding the homemade cake I had baked myself. Sarah stared at my Walmart clothes with open disgust. She looked at me as if I had carried disease into her house. The more successful they became, the more ashamed they were of me. To them, I represented everything outdated and embarrassing. A burden. A stain on the perfect upper-class family image they worked so hard to create. But they forgot one thing. The foundation of that perfect life had been built with the sweat and blood of this mechanic. My truck finally pulled into my driveway. The house was silent, empty, cold. I turned on the lights and stopped in front of the hallway mirror. My hair had turned completely white. Deep wrinkles cut across my face. I stared at my reflection and asked myself one simple question. Jack, did you really sacrifice your entire life just to earn a smirk from your daughter-in-law and rejection from your only son? No. It was time to end this suffering. If you believe parents deserve respect after a lifetime of sacrifice, hit the like button right now to support family justice stories like this one. Because that very night I opened an old steel safe hidden in the back of my closet. Inside was a dusty brown folder I had not touched in years. Ethan and Sarah had forgotten one very important detail about the house they were living in. They had no idea there was a small secret buried inside those property documents. A secret that would destroy their entire world within the next 30 days. I sat alone in the silent room, turning page after page of the old brown documents. With every sheet I touched, more painful memories came flooding back. Their disrespect had not happened overnight. It was years of humiliation. Years of being pushed out of my own son's life, piece by piece. I remembered my grandson's 8th birthday party. I had saved part of my pension for 3 straight months just to buy him a large building block set. I was excited to bring it to their house. But the moment I stepped through the door, Sarah stopped me. She looked at the toy box, then looked at me with disgust. She said cheap plastic toys were harmful to children's development. She proudly explained that her son only played with imported organic wooden toys from Europe. My grandson saw me standing there. But he looked away. He was too busy playing with his brand new tablet. Ethan stood right beside them. He did not defend me, not even once. He simply rolled his eyes in annoyance. The toy box I bought with my hard-earned savings ended up abandoned beside the trash can near the front entrance. Another memory slammed into me. One night I suddenly came down with a terrible fever. My entire body shook uncontrollably. I was too weak to drive myself to the hospital. I called Ethan 3 times in a row. He answered on the 4th call. His voice was irritated. He said he was attending an important dinner party with major clients. Then he coldly told me if I was not dying yet, I could call an ambulance myself. He said I should stop interrupting the work that made him real money. Then the line went dead. That night I dragged myself into the freezing street alone, fighting tears as I searched for a taxi. That was the night reality finally woke me up. My eyes lowered to the old loan documents spread across the table. Ethan loved telling people he bought that luxury house with his own brilliance. He wanted everyone to believe he was some self-made tech genius. But the truth was very different. Back then his credit score was terrible. No bank wanted to hand a massive loan to a young startup dreamer with no stability. So I stepped in. I signed the papers as the co-borrower. I used my own old house as collateral. For the past 5 years, Ethan had been sending mortgage payments through a joint account under both our names. He always believed it was fully his account. Legally, it was not. I was the primary responsible party. That mansion belonged to me. Completely. Ethan and Sarah were nothing more than tenants living under my protection. My fist tightened. I had reached my limit. The final drop had fallen. I could not continue pretending to be the pathetic old father they could step on whenever they pleased. A bold plan slowly began forming inside my mind. I glanced at the clock. 3 in the morning. I picked up my phone and typed a message to my oldest friend, a veteran real estate attorney. At that moment, I knew exactly what I had to do to reclaim the dignity I had lost. And once the sun rose, the real game would begin. A silent reversal, a devastating move Ethan and Sarah would never see coming. At dawn, I arrived at Arthur's office. Arthur had been my best friend since high school. Over the years, he had become one of the most respected real estate attorneys in Michigan. He lowered his reading glasses and carefully examined the thick brown folder I placed on his desk. 10 long minutes passed in complete silence. Finally, Arthur looked up at me. The shock in his eyes said everything. He explained that legally, the 4-bedroom mansion in that wealthy Michigan neighborhood still belonged to me. Ethan's name had only been attached as a secondary borrower on the original loan agreement. Even more important, the monthly mortgage payments had always come from a joint account under both our names. That meant I held complete legal authority over the property. I could make any decision regarding the house without Ethan's permission. Arthur stared at me carefully and asked if I truly wanted to go through with this. He warned me there would be no turning back. I did not hesitate. I looked him straight in the eye and nodded. I finally woke up. I told him quietly. The remaining balance on the mansion was $280,000. That debt was the very thing Ethan and Sarah feared most, while their tech business struggled through a cash flow crisis. What they did not know was that I had a secret savings account, money from the sale of my old mechanic shop property, insurance money accumulated over decades. I had never told them about it. Originally, I planned to leave that money behind for my grandchildren. Not anymore. I instructed Arthur to immediately pay off the entire remaining mortgage balance. Every last dollar of my life savings disappeared in a single transaction. Then the words appeared on the bank system screen. Paid in full. At that moment, a strange feeling of freedom ran through my body. The mansion worth more than $1 million now belonged entirely to me. Completely. I could sell it, rent it, or throw every person living inside it onto the street. I told Arthur to find a buyer immediately. I was willing to sell slightly below market value as long as the deal was cash only and completely confidential. Arthur was a professional. He smiled faintly and said he already had a client from New York looking for property in that exact area. The investor was prepared to pay cash within a week. For the first time in years, I smiled back, but it was not the smile of a broken old man. It was cold, sharp, almost unfamiliar even to myself. While Ethan and Sarah continued attending luxury parties and looking down on the old mechanic they were ashamed of, the legal trap had already begun closing around them. They still believed they owned a beautiful castle. They still believed they had the power to erase me from their lives. What they did not realize was that the mechanic they mocked had just bought back their entire luxury lifestyle with a single signature. By the time I stepped out of Arthur's office, the winter sky had already darkened into evening. The icy wind still cut through the streets. But inside me something burned hotter than fire. Half of the plan was already complete. I climbed back into my truck and drove toward their mansion one last time. Before the storm arrived, I needed to collect the things that still belonged to me. The sale of the house happened faster than I expected. Thanks to Arthur's expertise, the investor from New York agreed to buy the mansion for $1,020,000 in cash. The contract was signed privately inside Arthur's office. Every detail remained completely confidential. The money was wired directly into a brand new personal account under my name. I stared at the 10-digit balance glowing on my phone screen. This was the price of my freedom. 4 days later, I returned to the mansion at 2 in the morning. That was usually the hour Ethan and Sarah were passed out after another exhausting night of luxury parties and expensive wine. I unlocked the front door using the spare key I had quietly kept all these years. The house was terrifyingly silent. I stepped softly across the polished hardwood floors and headed toward a small storage room in the basement. That room still contained a few forgotten pieces of my life. I did not take a single thing that belonged to them, only the things that belonged to me. A small wooden box filled with family photographs from the days when Ethan was still a baby. My father's old pocket watch, and my worn mechanic uniforms. The same uniforms that had fed this entire family for decades. I folded everything carefully into a small rolling suitcase. Before leaving, I stopped in the middle of the living room and looked toward the second floor. That was my son's bedroom. For a moment I wondered if Ethan ever remembered those freezing winter nights, when the two of us slept side by side inside a leaking rental house. Probably not. Wealth had erased his memory. My chest tightened painfully. A single hot tear rolled down my cheek, but it was the last tear I would ever shed for that son. From now on, I would live for myself. I quietly pulled the suitcase toward the door and slipped out into the darkness. My Ford F-150 had already been fully serviced and prepared. I drove straight toward Michigan International Airport. I left the truck in long-term parking and handed the spare key over to Arthur. The money from the truck sale would be transferred later. Then I walked into the airport terminal, carrying nothing but a one-way ticket to Florida. A place with warm sunlight, blue oceans, and no betrayal. By the time the plane began boarding, dawn was finally breaking across the horizon. I chose a seat beside the window. As the aircraft lifted into the clouds, I stared down at Michigan slowly disappearing beneath layers of gray winter sky. Then I pulled out my old phone. I removed the SIM card and dropped it into an empty paper cup beside me. Just like that, I vanished completely from their lives. But I did not leave without a final message. On the dining table inside the mansion, I had left behind a plain white envelope. And inside that envelope was something that would turn their peaceful morning into the worst nightmare they had ever experienced. The plane touched down in Florida beneath bright sunlight and warm ocean air. As the cabin doors opened, a soft sea breeze rushed inside. I stepped out of the airport and took a long, deep breath. For the first time in years, my chest no longer felt heavy. I took a taxi straight to the condominium I had rented near the beach. The apartment had a wide balcony overlooking the endless blue ocean. I sat down in a wicker chair, poured myself a cold drink, and turned on a brand new phone with a completely new number. At last I began enjoying the peace I deserved. Meanwhile, back in Michigan, the white envelope on the dining table had almost certainly been opened by now. Inside the envelope there were no insults, no anger, no curses. I had left only two things behind. The first was a detailed financial record I had personally kept over the last 15 years. Every dollar was listed clearly. $80,000 for student loans, $200,000 for the house down payment, $520,000 for tuition gifts, living expenses, and business support throughout the years. Total amount, $800,000. At the bottom of the page, I had written one final sentence. This is the cost of raising an ungrateful son. I freely gave you this money as your father. Consider my duty completed. The second document was an official legal notice stamped by Arthur's law office and the county property authority. The notice clearly stated that the remaining mortgage balance on the 4-bedroom mansion had been fully paid off and that the property had already been legally sold to a new owner from New York. Every dollar from the sale had been transferred into my account. Ethan and Sarah no longer held any legal rights to the property. I could almost picture Ethan's face when he read it, his skin turning pale, the coffee cup slipping from his hand and shattering across the marble floor. Sarah screaming in panic as her eyes reached the final paragraph of the notice. The eviction deadline. The new owner was a serious investor. They did not care about excuses or family drama. Ethan and Sarah had exactly 30 days to remove every belonging and leave the mansion. Otherwise, law enforcement would remove them by force. I took another slow sip of water while watching seagulls glide across the Florida shoreline. They once told me my absence would be the greatest gift I could give them. Well, now they finally had it. Completely. But the punishment for betrayal had only just begun. The collapse of their perfect upper-class fantasy would happen far faster than they ever imagined. That evening, my new phone suddenly began vibrating non-stop. A message from Arthur appeared on the screen. Attached to it was a photograph taken outside my former mansion. And the image made one thing very clear. A brutal war had just begun. The photo Arthur sent to my phone showed a large moving truck parked directly in front of the mansion. Men in uniform were carrying cardboard boxes out through the front door. The new owner from New York was not wasting any time. They had arrived earlier than expected to inspect the property. The collapse of their sandcastle had officially begun. If you have made it this far into the story, then this story probably touched you in some way. Please help us with one quick thing. Hit subscribe if you have not subscribed yet. Leave a like and comment number 2 so I know you stayed until this part. Many people watch without doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Over the next 2 weeks, Ethan and Sarah's luxurious life completely unraveled. Arthur kept updating me through short emails. Ethan's tech company was collapsing under the pressure of losing the $280,000 I had used to pay off the house mortgage. Without that money, they no longer had any major asset to use as collateral for new loans. Ethan's reputation in the business world began falling apart. People started whispering about the young tech executive whose own father had sold the family mansion and thrown him out onto the street. Meanwhile, Sarah faced humiliation at her elite country club. The same people who once flattered her now avoided her like she carried a contagious disease. To survive financially and continue paying employees, Sarah was forced to sell her luxury handbag collection piece by piece. The Aspen ski vacation for the grandchildren was canceled immediately. For the first time in their lives, the children watched their parents scream at each other every night over money. The beautiful 4-bedroom mansion that once symbolized their success had become a psychological prison. Every passing day brought them closer to the eviction deadline hanging over their heads. They searched desperately for a cheap rental apartment. From a luxury estate in an upscale neighborhood, they were preparing to move into a cramped apartment in a middle-class district. For people as prideful as Ethan and Sarah, the humiliation was unbearable. The punishment was harsh, but deserved. Meanwhile, I sat peacefully on my balcony in Florida, watching waves crash gently against the shore. I did not feel joy. I did not feel revenge. Only relief. Justice had finally arrived in the fairest way possible. Sometimes I still wonder, was selling the house cruel, or was it simply the lesson they desperately needed? Maybe someone out there can answer that question for me. Just as I was about to turn off my phone and go to sleep, the screen suddenly lit up again. This time it was not Arthur. An unknown number from Michigan kept calling over and over. I finally pressed accept. For a few seconds all I heard was heavy breathing, mixed with alcohol-soaked sobbing. Then came the voice of my son. Broken. Angry. Desperate. The conversation I had known was coming from the very beginning had finally begun. On the other end of the call, Ethan's breathing was heavy and soaked in alcohol. He stayed silent for a few seconds before suddenly exploding into screams. His voice was hoarse with rage. He demanded to know where I was. He demanded to know how I could be so cruel to my only son. He shouted that selling the house had destroyed his career. He said Sarah was crying every day and threatening divorce because she could not survive the humiliation. He accused me of being a heartless father. I did not interrupt him once. I turned on speakerphone and placed the phone quietly on the stone table beside my balcony chair. Then I listened. I listened to every accusation coming from the son I once loved more than my own life. The silence only made Ethan more desperate. After several minutes of screaming into emptiness, his voice finally cracked. Then he began sobbing like a child. He begged me to come back. He said he knew he had been wrong. He begged me to lend him the money from the house sale so he could save his company. He even promised he would throw Sarah out of his life forever, if that was what I wanted. I stared out at the dark ocean beneath the moonlight. Inside me there was nothing left but coldness. I slowly picked up the phone and held it to my ear. My voice was calm, firm, final. I told him I still loved him. But the days of me cleaning up every disaster in his life had ended on that Christmas Eve. I reminded him that he was the one who chose my absence. And now I was finally giving him that gift completely. Ethan screamed that he was my blood. He asked how I could abandon my own son so easily. I answered him with a question instead. I asked if he remembered his son's birthday party when my gift had been left beside the garbage can. I asked if he remembered the night I had a high fever and begged him for help only for him to tell me to call an ambulance because entertaining clients mattered more. I asked if he remembered introducing me to his rich friends as some poor old mechanic from the countryside, an old family acquaintance. Silence. The only sound left on the line was Ethan's broken sobbing. I told him that mansion had been built with my sweat and blood, and when my dignity was destroyed inside those walls, I had every right to take it back. Then I wished him luck with his new life. And I hung up. I blocked the number immediately. That night, I slept better than I had in years. For the first time, I truly believed Ethan had finally received the most expensive lesson of his life. My decision had forced his family onto an entirely different path. But the story did not end there. 3 months later, while walking along a windy Florida beach at sunset, I suddenly noticed a familiar figure standing beneath the palm trees waiting for me. It was the last person I ever expected to see there. The familiar figure standing beneath the palm trees was Ethan. He was no longer wearing expensive cashmere sweaters. Instead, he wore a faded t-shirt and an old pair of worn jeans. His face looked hollow, dark circles hung beneath exhausted eyes. In only 3 months, he seemed to have aged 10 years since that bitter Christmas night in Michigan. I stopped walking and kept a careful distance between us. I did not look angry. I did not look surprised. I simply looked at him with the calm eyes of a man who had finally let go of the past. The moment Ethan saw me, he slowly walked forward. His legs trembled with every step. Arthur had eventually given him my address after becoming convinced that Ethan's regret was genuine. Ethan stopped in front of me and lowered his head. He told me the mansion in Michigan had officially been taken over by the new owner. His family had moved into a small 2-bedroom rental apartment in a working-class neighborhood. His tech company was gone. Bankrupt, he had sold his luxury car to pay off debts. Now he worked as an ordinary technician for a small company, working 12-hour shifts every day just to afford diapers and groceries for his children. Then his voice broke. He admitted Sarah could not endure the loss of status and comfort. She had packed her things and returned to her parents' house. Alone inside those cramped apartment walls, Ethan finally began understanding the loneliness I once carried. He remembered the years I worked 2 jobs to raise him. He remembered the scars on my hands. And then he cried. Real tears. Heavy tears of regret rolled down his exhausted face. He told me he had not come to Florida to ask for money. He only wanted to say sorry to me face to face. He said he finally understood the value of his father after losing everything himself. I stood there quietly looking at my son. Somewhere deep inside me, something shifted slightly. Not weakness, not anger, just a quiet ripple in a heart that had once been shattered. The lesson had been brutal, but it had finally forced Ethan to grow up. For the first time in his life, he understood work, responsibility, consequences. I slowly nodded and agreed to sit with him on a nearby stone bench so I could hear the rest of what he came to say. This meeting would decide the future of our relationship forever. Ethan's hands trembled as he reached into his jacket pocket and carefully pulled out a small object. Then he placed it into my hand. The moment I saw it, my heart tightened painfully inside my chest. Because that object carried one final secret. And that secret was about to change everything in the final chapter of this story. The object Ethan placed in my hand was my father's old pocket watch. During the chaos of moving out of the mansion, he had found it hidden beneath a cabinet. Instead of selling it or throwing it away, he had carefully protected it through those painful months. He told me it was the only piece of our family he still felt deserved to be returned to me. He said he was no longer worthy of keeping it. I held the worn metal watch tightly in my hand, and for the first time in a very long time, something inside me softened. I looked down at my son kneeling in the sand beneath the Florida sunset. Slowly I reached down and helped him back to his feet. Then I told him something he never expected to hear. I forgave him, because punishment was never meant to destroy him. It was meant to save what remained of his soul. I needed him to understand that a father's love is not an endless wallet to be drained and disrespected forever. The two of us sat quietly together, watching the sun disappear into the ocean horizon. And there, beside the crashing waves, I established a new boundary between us. I would never return to Michigan. I would never financially rescue him again. His small apartment, his debts, his responsibilities, those belonged to him now. But I told him I would reopen communication so I could speak to my grandchildren again. I would remain their grandfather, even from a distance. Ethan nodded through tears. For the first time in years, his gratitude felt real. Sometimes loving your children means knowing when to let go so they can finally grow up. And never spoil someone so much that they become cruel enough to forget the hands that sacrificed everything for them. To every parent listening to this story, remember one thing. Never forget your own worth. Your sacrifices are priceless, and you deserve respect until your very last breath. Thank you for supporting Dad's Real Life Revenge. Join our community by hitting the like button and subscribing for more raw emotional family stories filled with hard truths and real consequences. And as always, thank you for being part of this space. They said my life wasn't worth more than a set of golf clubs. But they had no idea I was hiding an $80 million secret. I sat in a kitchen soaked in the smell of mildew and loneliness. The ticking wall clock sounded like it was counting down the final days of my life. In front of me were two bills side by side. One was for repairing my battered old truck so I could get around. The other was for my blood pressure and heart medication. I opened my wallet. Only a few crumpled bills remained. I had to choose between being able to move or being able to breathe. My name is Stephen, a father who spent his entire life building a future for his children, only to realize that in their eyes, I had become nothing more than an old debt, an embarrassing secret they wanted hidden away behind the walls of their luxury mansions. Welcome to Dad's Real Life Revenge. Stay with me until the end of this story, and leave a comment with the city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story has traveled. Yesterday, I called Melvin. He said he was busy. Linda hung up the second she heard me cough. They were terrified I was going to ask for money. Terrified that my poverty might infect their glamorous lives. I pressed a hand against my chest as the pain tightened. Not because of the illness, because of the betrayal. I stared out the window as memories flooded back. I used to work double shifts so Melvin could have his first set of golf clubs. I skipped meals so Linda could wear the prettiest dress at prom. And now here I was, counting pills, the same way I counted the shattered pieces of my life. This house was too large for a man waiting to die, yet somehow too small to hold the compassion of my children. I grabbed the old newspaper wedged beneath the crooked table leg. My hands trembled. I wasn't afraid of death. I was afraid of disappearing without anyone even noticing. But life always takes unexpected turns. Just when I was ready to give up everything. Just when I had accepted that I was a complete failure. The phone rang. An unknown number. A lawyer. A will from a distant cousin named Percy. Percy. The only person I had ever taken the time to truly listen to at a dreary funeral years ago. Turns out kindness is never forgotten. It simply waits for the right moment to bloom. A 2,000-acre ranch and $80 million appeared before me like the wildest dream imaginable. But before I could claim any of it, I had to do one thing. I had to carry out one final test for the people I once called family. I stared at the old phone as if it had suddenly turned into a solid bar of gold. On the other end of the line was the calm, professional voice of Attorney Morrison. He repeated the number one more time. $80 million. My ears rang. My aging heart pounded wildly inside my frail chest. I asked him if he had mistaken me for someone else. But no. Percy had named me directly in a 10-page will. I remembered Percy well. A quiet man the family always treated like an oddball. At his wife's funeral 10 years ago, everyone else spent their time gossiping about designer suits and expensive jewelry. I was the only one who stayed beside Percy. I listened to him talk about the sun-scorched fields of Texas for an entire afternoon. I did not do it for money. I did it because I understood what it felt like to be abandoned. And now that simple act of kindness had brought me an enormous fortune. Attorney Morrison explained that I was not only inheriting cash, I was now the legal owner of a 2,000-acre ranch, an entire kingdom of cattle herds, and open land stretching all the way to the horizon. One moment I was counting blood pressure pills to survive, and the next I had become one of the wealthiest men in the region. The shock quickly gave way to a deep, bitter ache. I looked around my miserable kitchen. The cracks in the walls and the leaking ceiling seemed to mock me. I was rich yet still alone. I had $80 million, Yet my own children saw me as nothing more than a cheap burden. Attorney Morrison hesitated before reading the final condition of the will. Percy had left behind one last message. Money is a powerful acid. It can melt away the fake masks people wear. He wanted me to keep the inheritance a secret until the test was complete. I tightened my grip around the phone as a daring idea flashed through my mind. I would not rush to put on an expensive suit. I would remain poor, sick old Stephen in the eyes of my children. I wanted to know if there was still even a tiny piece of humanity left inside Melvin and Linda's hearts, or if they had already let the devil guide them completely. I held Percy's letter tightly in my hands. His handwriting was strong and decisive, just like the man himself. Attorney Morrison had just emailed me a copy. Every sentence struck my mind like a hammer blow. Percy wrote that he had spent decades watching this entire family. He called them a flock of vultures circling the corpses of wealth. They only appeared when they smelled money. They only smiled when they saw numbers. Percy chose me because, according to him, I still possessed something the others had lost long ago: sincerity. He wrote, "Stephen, you were the only person who looked into my eyes instead of staring at the watch on my wrist." But Percy also left behind a chilling warning. Money does not change people. It simply reveals who they truly are. He warned me to be extremely careful. Once this secret came to light, the people closest to me could become the most dangerous. They would not stop until they stripped every last thing from me. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I sat silently in the darkness of my living room. The glow from my phone screen illuminated the deep wrinkles on my face. I was holding a power capable of changing everyone's lives around me. But I was also holding a spark that could burn everything to ashes. Percy wanted me to carry out a test of the human heart. A test whose outcome might shatter my heart all over again. I began questioning myself. Did I really want to know the truth? Did I truly have the courage to see my children's real faces when forced to choose between family and money? I took a long, deep breath. I had to do this. Not only because of Percy's will, but because of myself. I needed to know whether I still had a real family left. My trembling fingers moved across the contacts on my phone until Melvin's name appeared on the screen. My eldest son. The child I had once been so proud of. The son I sacrificed my youth for so he could build the successful life he has today. I pressed the call button. A single phone call that would begin a chain of horrifying truths I could never have imagined. The phone rang for a long time before someone finally answered. On the other end, I could hear the noisy atmosphere of an upscale country club. Golf clubs clinked together in the background. Melvin's voice came through impatient and irritated. He asked what could possibly be so important that I had to call at this hour. I forced my voice to sound as weak and shaky as possible. I told him the doctor had just warned me that I was at high risk of suffering a stroke. I needed about $5,000 a month to pay for specialized medication and a caregiver. A terrifying silence followed. I could hear Melvin letting out a long, frustrated sigh through the phone. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not ask whether I was in pain. The very first thing he did was complain about money. He said business had been difficult lately. He had just paid expensive piano tuition for his son. Then there was all the new hockey equipment and the luxury summer vacation the family had already planned. I reminded him that this was a matter of life and death. I only needed help for a few months to get through this dangerous period. Melvin snapped. He said $5,000 was far too much money. He told me I should consider selling my old house or applying for government assistance. Then he said something that made my heart nearly stop. "That's your problem, Dad. Figure it out yourself." I sat there in stunned silence. "So you would rather buy golf clubs than help your father stay alive?" Melvin never answered the question directly. He simply said he had to get back to an important game with business partners. He could not let personal matters interfere with work. Then the line went dead. The endless beeping afterward felt like a knife carving into my chest. The son I once carried in my arms. The little boy I sacrificed meals and comfort for. The child I gave everything to. Now he considered his father's life worth less than a luxury hobby. I collapsed into my worn-out armchair. Hot tears rolled down my wrinkled cheeks. The test had only just begun, yet I already felt like a defeated man. But I could not stop now. I still had a daughter. Linda had always said she loved me more than anyone else in the world. Would Linda be any different from her brother? Or would my precious little girl also push me into the abyss of disappointment? If you believe kindness is always rewarded, make sure to like and subscribe so you do not miss the moment when the ungrateful finally face the consequences of their betrayal. I placed the phone back on the table. My hands were still trembling after Melvin's cruel words. The last bit of hope I had left rested with Linda, my daughter, who always spoke sweetly whenever the holidays came around. I dialed her number. The ringing echoed through the room. At that moment it sounded more like a warning siren than a phone call. Linda answered. Loud music and cheerful laughter blasted through the speaker behind her. I repeated the same story. I told her about the looming risk of a stroke and the $5,000 I needed each month to stay alive. Linda went silent for a second. But it was not the silence of compassion. Her voice suddenly sharpened as she began interrogating me. She asked if I was being scammed by someone. She said the world was full of con artists targeting elderly people. My throat tightened as I explained that this came directly from my doctor. I truly needed her help. Then Linda started complaining. She said she was already struggling with the expenses of living in a luxury apartment. She had just signed payments for a brand new luxury SUV. Linda insisted she had absolutely no extra money. Please understand, Dad, she said. I have my own life and pressures you wouldn't understand. I mentioned the new SUV. I asked whether she could delay some of her spending to help save her father's life. Linda's tone instantly turned irritated. She said the vehicle was necessary for her work and social image. She could not show up in front of wealthy friends driving an old, embarrassing car. Then she said she had an important appointment and abruptly hung up. The lifeless tone of the disconnected call filled the room. I looked toward the mirror. A frail old man with cloudy eyes stared back at me. 2 children, 2 phone calls, and 2 buckets of ice water thrown straight into my face. They had money for expensive golf clubs. They had money for luxury SUVs. But they did not have a single dollar for the life of the father who raised them. That truth hurt even more than death itself. I felt like an abandoned ruin. I sat alone in the darkness, wondering if there was any reason left to continue this test at all. Then, suddenly, I heard the rumbling sound of an old engine pulling into the yard. Headlights shined through the cracks in the front door. Someone was arriving in the middle of the night. What I did not know was that this meeting would completely change the way I viewed human kindness. An angel was about to appear at the exact moment I had lost all hope, and when you discover who that person is, you will not be able to hold back your tears. The old wooden door groaned as I pulled it open. Beneath the dim streetlight, a battered pickup truck rattled loudly in the driveway. A small figure stepped out, exhausted from lack of sleep, yet his eyes burned with worry. It was Tyler, my grandson. The boy had driven non-stop for 800 miles from his university the moment he overheard part of my phone call with his father. Tyler rushed toward me and wrapped his arms around me tightly. He was trembling with fear for his grandfather's health. He did not ask about money. He asked if I had eaten. He asked how I was feeling. He gently helped me back inside his young and steady hands, supporting my frail body. Then Tyler placed an old, worn envelope onto the table. The corners were frayed from being carried around too long. He told me there was $843 inside. Every single dollar he had managed to save from working part-time at a bakery and washing cars over the past 2 years. Tyler grabbed my hand, his voice shaking with emotion. "Grandpa, don't worry about the medicine anymore," he whispered. "I already decided I'm taking a break from college next semester. I'll work 2 jobs if I have to. I'll make the $5,000 every month somehow." Then he said the words that shattered what remained of my broken heart. Money can be earned again. But I only have one grandfather. While my own children were choosing luxury resorts for their vacations, my grandson was choosing to sacrifice his education just to save my life. My chest tightened as a powerful wave of emotion crashed through me. I looked into Tyler's sincere eyes, and for the first time in years I saw hope in humanity again. This boy was willing to give up his future for an old man his own parents treated like a burden. I broke down crying. But these tears were not born from pain. They came from being deeply moved beyond words. If you have stayed with us this far, please take one quick moment to subscribe. So many people watch without doing it, but it costs nothing and means everything to us. I squeezed Tyler's hand tightly. At that moment I knew I had finally found the rightful heir to Percy's legacy. But Tyler still had no idea about the enormous secret I was carrying. He still believed I was dying and penniless. I stared at the envelope filled with my grandson's sweat-stained savings, and a new plan slowly began forming in my mind. A plan not only to punish the wicked, but to bless the good-hearted. I wiped away my tears and looked deeply into Tyler's eyes. I was about to tell him a truth that would change his life forever. But first there was one final thing I needed to test. I looked at Tyler as he continued checking the medicine bottles on the table. He had no idea he had just passed one of the cruelest tests imaginable. I took a deep breath. The truth caught in my throat as I grabbed his rough hands worn from hard work. "Tyler," I said softly, "listen to me. I do not have a stroke, and I do not need your savings." Tyler froze. He stared at me in complete shock. Slowly I began telling him everything. About the phone call from Attorney Morrison. About my distant cousin Percy. About the $80 million inheritance, and about the cold-hearted betrayal of his own parents. Tyler sat there, speechless. Tears rolled down his face, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of relief. He threw his arms around me and thanked God that I was still healthy. Not once did he ask how much money he would receive. That alone shattered me in the best possible way. I cried again, this time from pure happiness. "You protected my future," I told him. "Now I am going to protect yours." I explained that this entire plan had been created to discover who truly deserved a place in my new life. Tyler had chosen loyalty over money. He had won a game his parents had lost completely. While my children were choosing luxury resorts for their vacations, my grandson was preparing to sacrifice his education just to save my life. That thought echoed endlessly in my mind. For the first time in years, I felt a new strength rising inside me. The weakness and hopelessness disappeared. In their place stood the determination of a man now holding the power to shape destinies. I told Tyler we would not spend another minute inside this damp, miserable house. We were going to Texas, to the massive ranch waiting for us, to the beginning of an entirely new chapter. But I was not ready to end this game yet, no. I wanted to see Melvin and Linda's faces when they realized what they had thrown away. A perfect transformation plan was already taking shape in my mind. I would return someday, but not as the pitiful old man they abandoned. And when they saw the new version of me standing before them, what would they do then? Tyler and I left the old house that very night. The journey to Texas became a true transformation. No more exhausted coughing, no more meals measured down to the last dollar. I walked into a luxury clothing store and bought myself the finest suit I had worn in over 20 years. When I looked into the mirror, I no longer saw the defeated old Stephen. I saw a man with power, a man with confidence. We finally arrived at the 2,000-acre ranch. It was a breathtaking paradise of endless green fields and a grand estate standing proudly beneath the Texas sky. I bought a powerful new pickup truck. I hired the best lawyers money could buy to protect Percy's legacy. My life had changed completely. But one thing remained exactly the same: my silence toward Melvin and Linda. My phone began vibrating nonstop. Melvin was calling. Linda was sending messages. Maybe they had heard rumors from old neighbors. Or maybe they suddenly realized that losing contact with me also meant losing control. I looked at their names, flashing across the screen, and smiled calmly. Then I pressed decline. The feeling was strange. I had spent my entire life trying to please them. But now I was the one controlling the game. I stood on the balcony of the mansion and watched Tyler laughing as he ran freely across the open fields. For the first time in years, the boy could return to school without worrying about tuition or survival. I had spent 63 years living according to everyone else's expectations. But from this day forward, people would have to earn a place in my life. Still, my silence was only the beginning of a much larger storm. Melvin and Linda were not the type to give up once they smelled money. They were already planning to come here. They believed a few fake apologies would be enough to get their hands on the fortune. What they did not know was that I had prepared a welcome they would never forget. The direct confrontation was coming, and when the truth was finally exposed, would they even dare to look me in the eyes? The roaring engine of a luxury SUV shattered the peaceful silence of the ranch. Melvin and Linda stepped out of the vehicle, their eyes sweeping across the massive estate with shock and greed. Linda rushed toward me, trying to throw her arms around me. In the sweetest voice imaginable, she said how worried she had been about me. She called me Daddy, as though that cold-hearted phone call from weeks earlier had never happened. Beside her, Melvin forced an awkward smile and complimented my suit, saying I looked incredibly distinguished. I stood there with my arms crossed, staring at them with eyes as cold as ice. I did not invite them inside. Instead, I remained on the front porch and calmly repeated every cruel word they had said to me. I asked Melvin about his new golf clubs. I asked Linda about the shiny SUV she could not sacrifice to save her father's life. Their faces shifted from pale to burning red with shame. Melvin stuttered that he had only been joking back then. Linda quickly blamed stress from work and claimed she had not been thinking clearly. I let out a dry, bitter laugh. It was no longer the laugh of a broken old man. It carried authority, power, finality. "I have heard enough," I said. "I spent my entire life building a foundation for both of you, and you treated me like a debt that needed to disappear. When I needed $5,000 to survive, you turned your backs on me. But the moment $80 million appeared suddenly, you remembered what family means." I looked directly into their eyes. "I will no longer accept scraps of affection. Now I decide who deserves a place in my life." Then I motioned for Tyler to step forward. The moment Melvin saw his own son standing beside me, his expression froze in disbelief. I told them plainly that Tyler had been the only person willing to drive 800 miles to save me while his parents were busy enjoying luxury vacations and expensive hobbies. "Your betrayal showed me who my real family truly is." Linda immediately burst into tears and began begging for forgiveness. Melvin tried using logic and excuses, desperately arguing about family rights and misunderstandings. But I had already turned away. "I spent 63 years living for other people," I said, without looking back. "From today onward, if either of you wants a place in my life, you will have to earn it." Those words hit them harder than any slap ever could. At that moment they understood the gates of this ranch had closed forever to the ungrateful. But the punishment was still not over. Because hidden inside the new will I signed that very morning was one final card. A final move that would leave Melvin and Linda drowning in regret for the rest of their lives. I stood there watching their SUV disappear into the cloud of dust, trailing along the dirt road, leading away from the ranch. In my hands rested the new will, officially signed and sealed by Attorney Morrison. I had made my final decision. Every dollar of the fortune, and every acre of this ranch, would belong to Tyler. The boy was not simply inheriting money. He was receiving the reward for the compassion and integrity his parents had thrown away long ago. I lowered myself into the armchair on the porch and quietly watched the blazing sunset paint the Texas fields in deep shades of red and gold. This feeling of peace was something $80 million could never buy. Only truth and inner peace could give a man that. For the first time in years, I no longer felt hatred, only relief. Melvin and Linda would now spend the rest of their lives carrying the memory of how cheaply they valued their father's life. They did not lose because I became rich. They lost because they were spiritually bankrupt. Money does not change people. It only reveals who they truly are. I had seen the real faces of the people I once loved most. But I had also discovered light in the place I least expected. Family is the one who stays when life becomes difficult, not the one who appears when money arrives. Share this story if you would choose loyalty over wealth. I closed my eyes and listened to the wind moving across the endless grasslands. For the first time in a very long while, I felt that I truly belonged somewhere. The journey from that miserable kitchen to this magnificent ranch was never only about becoming wealthy. It was about reclaiming my dignity. My story may end here, but the new life Tyler and I are building has only just begun. What would you do if you were faced with Percy's test? Leave your thoughts below, and thank you for staying with me until the very end. My future son-in-law Julian was casually insulting my daughter Chloe right there in my car. He sneered into the phone with his friend. He called Chloe annoying. He said comforting her was just a mandatory procedure before the wedding. Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Grab a glass of water, some snacks, get comfortable, and remember this: the people in these stories had every opportunity to do the right thing, they simply chose otherwise. Leave a number 1 in the comments so we can continue the story, and hit subscribe, you're going to love this one. The story began with the screeching sound of tires sliding across the damp road. Through the rearview mirror I saw Julian's face. He was leaning back in the rear seat, his eyes fixed on his phone screen, a smug smile spread across his face. He had no idea that the rideshare driver taking him to his destination was actually his future father-in-law. To Julian, I was just an invisible man. An elderly driver, quiet, always wearing a mask that covered most of his face, and a cap pulled low over his eyes. He casually insulted my daughter, his fiancée, treating her like a commodity. I heard every single word clearly, and I would remember them for a very long time because those words were like knives stabbing straight into the heart of a father. The daughter I cherished, like a priceless treasure, was in his eyes. Nothing more than a target with a price tag attached. My blood felt as though it were boiling. I had to use every bit of composure I had left to stop myself from turning the car around and punching that fake face of his. I took a deep breath and forced myself to remain silent. I needed to stay clear-headed. My anger at that moment would ruin everything. The car continued moving forward through the suffocating silence. Julian kept talking endlessly about his plans to manipulate Chloe after they were married. He had calculated every step to strip my daughter of her freedom. The deception was obvious in every cold word that came out of his mouth. I looked at myself again in the rearview mirror. The expression in my eyes was no longer one of shock. It had become the determination of a father willing to do whatever it took to protect his child. This battle was only beginning. Julian thought he was smart, but he had no idea that this rearview mirror was capturing every part of his true nature. Julian ended the call. Silence once again settled over the cramped interior of the car. I watched him through the still rearview mirror. Julian adjusted the collar of his neatly pressed shirt. He ran a hand through his hair, restoring his usual polished appearance. He paid absolutely no attention to the driver sitting in front of him. Becoming invisible in Julian's eyes was actually very easy. All I needed was a black medical mask, a pair of sunglasses that concealed my eyes, and a baseball cap pulled low over my forehead. But the biggest reason he failed to recognize me was his arrogance. To a young and successful chief financial officer like Julian, people who worked with their hands were nothing more than part of the scenery. He looked, but he never truly saw. He climbed into the car, gave his destination, and immediately disappeared into his own world of privilege. I still remember the very first day I accepted his ride 3 weeks earlier. When the app displayed the passenger's name as Julian and the pickup location as a luxury apartment complex in the suburbs, my heart skipped a beat. He was the fiancé Chloe always spoke about with such pride. The moment he opened the door and stepped into the back seat, I held my breath. I was afraid he would recognize me. I was afraid my presence would somehow damage my daughter's relationship. But Julian merely glanced at his phone screen and casually told me to get moving. My initial relief quickly turned into a bitter realization. The man who was about to marry my daughter was a completely different person when she wasn't around. For the past 3 weeks, I had quietly become the keeper of evidence, documenting Julian's double life. While Chloe looked at him with admiration and love, I sat here witnessing his cold conversations, selfish calculations, and carefully hidden contempt. Every ride was a new chapter in the book of lies he was writing. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. A feeling of helplessness and pain rose inside me. Was I protecting my daughter through this cowardly silence? Or was I becoming an accomplice to a deceiver? The car stopped at another red light. Julian sighed impatiently. He pulled out his phone again and dialed a new number. I stared into the rearview mirror, holding my breath as I waited. Julian's voice filled the car once more, this time lower, more secretive, carrying a revelation that could shatter the entire future Chloe was dreaming of. Julian ended the call. Silence once again settled over the cramped interior of the car. I watched him through the still rearview mirror. Julian adjusted the collar of his neatly pressed shirt. He ran a hand through his hair, restoring his usual polished appearance. He paid absolutely no attention to the driver sitting in front of him. Becoming invisible in Julian's eyes was actually very easy. All I needed was a black medical mask, a pair of sunglasses that concealed my eyes, and a baseball cap pulled low over my forehead. But the biggest reason he failed to recognize me was his arrogance. To a young and successful chief financial officer like Julian, people who worked with their hands were nothing more than part of the scenery. He looked, but he never truly saw. He climbed into the car, gave his destination, and immediately disappeared into his own world of privilege. I still remember the very first day I accepted his ride 3 weeks earlier. When the app displayed the passenger's name as Julian and the pickup location as a luxury apartment complex in the suburbs, my heart skipped a beat. He was the fiancé Chloe always spoke about with such pride. The moment he opened the door and stepped into the back seat, I held my breath. I was afraid he would recognize me. I was afraid my presence would somehow damage my daughter's relationship. But Julian merely glanced at his phone screen and casually told me to get moving. My initial relief quickly turned into a bitter realization. The man who was about to marry my daughter was a completely different person when she wasn't around. For the past 3 weeks, I had quietly become the keeper of evidence, documenting Julian's double life. While Chloe looked at him with admiration and love, I sat here witnessing his cold conversations, selfish calculations, and carefully hidden contempt. Every ride was a new chapter in the book of lies he was writing. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. A feeling of helplessness and pain rose inside me. Was I protecting my daughter through this cowardly silence? Or was I becoming an accomplice to a deceiver? The car stopped at another red light. Julian sighed impatiently. He pulled out his phone again and dialed a new number. I stared into the rearview mirror, holding my breath as I waited. Julian's voice filled the car once more, this time lower, more secretive, carrying a revelation that could shatter the entire future Chloe was dreaming of. The personnel appointment decision in Phoenix, Arizona. My hands began to tremble. I nearly pressed the accelerator by mistake. Julian had started a new call. His voice sounded excited, but it was filled with calculated malice. He confirmed to the person on the other end that he had accepted the position of director at a new branch in Arizona. It was more than 1,800 miles away from our home, away from Columbus. My mind spun. Just last night, during our family dinner, Chloe had happily talked about how the two of them were looking to buy a small house only 3 blocks from mine. My daughter completely trusted that they would stay here close to family. She had no idea she was about to be uprooted and thrown into a strange land far from everything she knew. I bit my lip until I tasted blood to stop myself from shouting. Julian kept talking endlessly about his plans. He spoke about the move as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He did not need to discuss it with Chloe. He only needed to inform her once everything had already been decided. The deception had reached its peak. He was isolating my daughter. He wanted to sever every connection between her and the people who loved her. Alone in an unfamiliar place, she would be completely vulnerable and forced to depend on him. The anger inside me churned like a storm. I stared at the road ahead, but my thoughts were in chaos. My poor daughter was still drowning in a manufactured happiness. She was carefully planning her wedding while this man was secretly building a strategy to remove her family from her life. The contrast was cruel. It squeezed the heart of a father until it hurt. Julian leaned his head back against the seat. Then he said something to his best friend over the phone. The words made my blood run cold. The farther she is from her family, the easier everything becomes. I looked into the rearview mirror again. Julian was smiling. It was the satisfied smile of a man who believed he had already won the game. A chill settled deep inside me. I knew I could not remain silent any longer. Tonight would be our family dinner. I had to find a way to warn Chloe before it was too late, but I could never have imagined that my daughter's blind love and Julian's cunning manipulation would turn my attempt to protect her into a complete disaster. The family dinner took place in the suffocating atmosphere of our small kitchen. The warm yellow light shone down on Chloe's radiant face and Julian's perfect smile. Watching them sit side by side made my chest tighten. I could see the deception lurking beneath the neatly pressed shirt of my future son-in-law. I tried to remain calm. I refilled Julian's glass and carefully began asking about his plans for the future. I mentioned that his company was expanding into other states. Then I casually asked whether he had ever considered relocating somewhere far away like Arizona. The atmosphere at the table instantly shifted. Julian froze for a brief second. A flash of surprise crossed his eyes, but he quickly regained his usual composure. With an awkward smile, he brushed the question aside and said that he always prioritized whatever was best for Chloe. But Chloe's reaction was the real knife to my heart. My daughter immediately put down her chopsticks. She looked at me with disappointment and anger in her eyes. Chloe defended Julian fiercely. She said I was always too suspicious. She accused me of deliberately searching for flaws where none existed in order to ruin her happiness. The bond between father and daughter cracked right there in our own home. Then Chloe said something that shattered my heart. She told me that I was always waiting for things to fall apart just so I could prove that I had been right all along. Pain and helplessness rose like a lump in my throat. I looked at my daughter, a good person who was being cruelly deceived. The frustration of a father who knew the truth but could not immediately present the evidence pushed my emotions to their breaking point. I had to remain silent to keep the situation from getting worse. Julian sat there calmly, taking a small sip of wine. The look he gave me was openly provocative. He knew he had won this round. He had successfully turned me into nothing more than a paranoid, selfish old man in the eyes of his fiancée. The dinner ended in cold silence. Chloe stood up with Julian, and left without looking back at me even once. I remained alone in the darkness of the kitchen, listening as the sound of Julian's car faded into the distance. My anger hardened into an unshakable decision. Words alone were no longer enough. The next morning, Julian booked another ride with me. He climbed into the back seat with the same attitude, treating me as though I were invisible. Almost immediately, he called his attorney. I held my breath and adjusted the familiar rearview mirror to listen. The words that came out of his mouth next, concerning a secret contract, made me realize something horrifying. This man did not merely want to take my daughter far away from her family. He wanted to turn her into a prisoner with not a single dollar to her name. Julian's cold voice echoed from the back seat. He was on the phone with his private attorney. Once again, the rearview mirror became a witness to this man's cruelty. Julian began discussing a secret prenuptial agreement. Using dry legal terminology, he carefully calculated how to protect every part of his assets. But the most despicable part was that he was setting a trap designed to strip Chloe of her rights. He wanted her to sign unfavorable clauses without ever realizing what they meant. Helping others heal emotionally was my daughter's greatest passion. She had spent years studying to earn her position as a counselor. Yet over the phone, Julian openly declared that he would force Chloe to quit her job as soon as they were married. He said the work consumed too much time and offered no financial value to him. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles began to ache. The anger inside me churned until it felt like it was crushing my chest. Anyone could see that Julian was building an invisible cage around Chloe. He did not want a partner to share his life with. He wanted an obedient doll displayed behind glass. A woman with no career, no independent finances, and no meaningful connection to her family. That was how he planned to exert financial control and manipulate every aspect of my daughter's life. My inner thoughts shifted from fear and helplessness to unwavering determination. I could not stand by and watch my daughter walk willingly into that nightmare. The frustration I had suppressed for weeks had transformed into a burning resolve to act. I looked into the rearview mirror. There was no hesitation left in my eyes. Julian continued talking without pause, completely absorbed in what he believed was his flawless victory. He thought he was clever. He thought every piece on the board was exactly where he wanted it. But he had forgotten one thing. The invisible driver sitting in front of him was remembering every single word. I understood that the warnings I had tried to give Chloe at dinner the night before had been completely useless. Her blind faith in Julian required something stronger than my suspicions. I needed undeniable proof. I needed facts that could not be explained away. This deception had to be exposed at its source. The ride ended when Julian stepped out in front of a towering office building. He slammed the car door without a word of thanks and hurried off to join the flow of well-dressed professionals. I watched him disappear into the crowd, a cold feeling settling deep inside me. Then I pulled out my phone and called an old friend. It was time to enlist the help of someone who knew how to uncover the truth. What I did not expect was that the first warning from my old friend would send a chill down my spine and reveal just how dangerous the man my daughter intended to marry truly was. I arranged to meet Walter at a small diner tucked away on a quiet street corner. He was a former private investigator with 30 years of experience confronting the darker side of human nature. Walter looked over my rough notes, then lowered his reading glasses. He took a long breath, his voice calm, steady, and shaped by decades of experience. Walter spoke to me with complete seriousness. Men like Julian aren't criminals. They don't kill people or rob banks. They simply believe they're smarter than everyone else. Manipulators like him always leave traces in financial records and hidden schedules. Walter warned me to stop relying on suspicion alone. The anger of a father would cloud my judgment. What I needed was the truth. Only undeniable evidence could save Chloe. The advice from my old friend hit me like a bucket of cold water. It forced me to see things clearly. I could no longer continue playing the role of a passive driver. I began a quiet but dangerous search for the truth. Under Walter's guidance, I documented every time Julian entered my car. I recorded his calculating phone conversations through the rearview mirror. I collected drafts of prenuptial agreements that he accidentally left behind or discussed during rides. With each passing day, the phone in the pocket of this old driver filled with more evidence of Julian's selfishness and deception. The frustration inside me remained tightly controlled, transforming into the foundation of a carefully planned counterattack. If you've made it this far into the story, then perhaps you're enjoying it. Please do us a quick favor, like and subscribe. Leave a number 5 in the comments so I know you've watched this far, and tell me how you think the story will end to see whether your prediction is correct. Many people watch without doing that, but it costs you nothing and means a great deal to us. I slipped the phone back into my shirt pocket. It felt as though I were carrying a ticking time bomb. Every piece of Julian's double life had now been exposed. He was scheduled to sign a lease agreement in Arizona the following week. He was also close to finalizing the financial trap he had prepared for my daughter. Everything was moving at a terrifying speed. That afternoon, the ride request notification sounded once again. The passenger was Julian. I pulled my cap lower and drove to pick him up as usual. What I never expected was that during this ride, Julian would suddenly start a conversation with me. The man who had always treated me as if I were invisible now wanted advice from an old driver. It was a cruel joke of fate, one that pushed the tension to an entirely new level. Julian climbed into the car. This time he did not immediately look at his phone. Instead, he let out a long, weary sigh. Through the rearview mirror, I saw him lift his head and stare directly at the back of my neck. The silence lingered for several seconds. For the first time in 3 weeks, Julian voluntarily spoke to this invisible driver. His tone carried the usual arrogance disguised beneath a thin layer of false humility. He asked whether I had a family, and whether older women made unreasonable demands the way younger women supposedly did. The irony of the situation made my heart skip a beat. The manipulator was seeking marriage advice from the very father he was trying to isolate from his daughter. I forced my anger deep into my chest, deliberately lowering my voice and altering my manner of speaking so he would not recognize me. I answered with a simple piece of advice. Listen more than you talk. But Julian's arrogance ran too deep. He immediately dismissed my response. With a smug laugh, he launched into a lengthy speech about himself. He claimed that women did not know what they truly wanted until a successful man laid out a path for them. He proudly boasted that he had prepared a major surprise for his fiancée. Then, he began talking about tomorrow's extravagant engagement celebration at Brookside Country Club. That would be the moment, he said, when he would publicly announce all of his decisions in front of everyone. Once it was done before an audience, Chloe would have no way to refuse. I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead. My hands tightened around the steering wheel until they felt numb. The irony and hidden tension inside that vehicle had reached a breaking point. Julian genuinely believed he was designing a perfect future. He convinced himself that his control and manipulation would be wrapped in such a romantic package that nobody would dare oppose it. What he did not know was that every word he spoke and every piece of evidence he left behind was already in my possession. The car eventually stopped in front of his office building. Julian stepped out, threw one final arrogant glance in my direction, and walked away without another word. I watched his retreating figure through the windshield. My eyes were colder and more determined than they had ever been. The patience I had maintained for an entire month was nearly exhausted. Tomorrow he planned to unveil his perfect future. Tomorrow I planned to show Chloe exactly who had designed it. The final confrontation would take place at Brookside Country Club before 100 guests. I had everything I needed. What I never anticipated, however, was that the moment I abandoned my anonymity and exposed Julian would also uncover another horrifying secret hidden within those documents. A secret far darker than anything I had discovered so far. The ballroom at Brookside Country Club shimmered beneath sparkling lights while soft piano music drifted through the air. 100 elegantly dressed guests mingled and exchanged congratulations. Julian stood on the stage in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. Beside him stood Chloe. My daughter looked radiant in her pure white dress. She gazed at Julian with all the trust and love of a woman about to become a wife. The purity of my daughter only made the deception of the man beside her seem even more disgusting. Julian stepped up to the microphone. With confidence, he announced a surprise gift for his fiancée. He declared that the two of them would be moving to Arizona immediately after the wedding to begin a new life of luxury and success. Using polished romantic language, he transformed the act of isolating Chloe from her family into what sounded like a grand gesture of love. Chloe froze. The smile vanished from her face. Shock spread across her features. For the first time, uncertainty appeared in her eyes. Julian subtly tightened his arm around her waist, a silent reminder that she was expected to agree in front of 100 guests. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The frustration I had carried for weeks finally erupted. I stepped out from behind the ballroom doors. I was no longer dressed as a rideshare driver. I wore a tailored suit. I removed the black medical mask. I took off the sunglasses. Then I lifted my head and walked directly toward the stage. Whispers immediately spread throughout the room. "Dad," Chloe's voice trembled with shock. Julian saw me. For a brief moment, confusion flashed across his face. Then his familiar arrogance returned. He opened his mouth, preparing to greet his future father-in-law with polite charm. I never gave him the chance. I climbed onto the stage, pulled a thick folder from my jacket, and slammed it onto the signing table. The sharp crack echoed through the ballroom. Instantly, the room fell silent. The silence was so complete that it felt as though everyone could hear a single spoon hit the floor. I looked directly into Julian's eyes. Then I spoke loudly enough for every guest to hear. I exposed his entire scheme. I turned on the recorder I had carried in my pocket. Julian's cold, calculating voice filled the ballroom. "The farther she is from her family, the easier everything becomes." The words echoed through the stunned crowd. Then came the discussions about the secret prenuptial agreement, the clauses that would force Chloe to leave her career, the plans that would leave her financially dependent, the strategy designed to turn her into a prisoner with no assets and no independence. The color drained from Julian's face. His confidence vanished. His arrogance shattered. For the first time since I had known him, he looked afraid. Suddenly, he lunged toward me, attempting to grab the recorder. But Walter was already moving. My old friend stepped between us and blocked him. The mask had finally been ripped away. Before 100 witnesses, the respected financial executive stood exposed as a manipulative fraud. Whispers of shock swept through the crowd. Expressions of disgust appeared everywhere I looked. The carefully crafted image Julian had spent years building collapsed in a matter of minutes, and the satisfaction of seeing the truth revealed was overwhelming. Chloe stared at Julian as if she were looking at a complete stranger. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Then she turned toward me. In that moment she understood. Every warning, every concern, every uncomfortable question I had asked, they had all been true. Yet amid the chaos, something unexpected happened. Julian suddenly began to laugh. Not nervously, not awkwardly. He laughed wildly. The sound echoed across the silent ballroom. Then he fixed me with a look filled with hatred. His eyes moved toward the folder, lying on the table, and with a voice trembling between rage and triumph, he shouted one final sentence. A sentence that revealed a secret hidden within those documents. A secret that even I had not yet discovered because I had never finished reading every page. And the moment those words left his mouth, the entire room went silent once again. Julian shouted in desperation. He claimed that without him, my family's company would collapse into bankruptcy. He believed money could conceal every rotten part of his character. But he was wrong. Chloe stepped forward. She was no longer crying. The only things left in her eyes were cold determination and clarity. Slowly, she removed her diamond engagement ring. Then she threw it directly at Julian. In a firm voice, Chloe declared that he had never respected her. He had only ever loved himself. The crowd erupted into applause. Humiliated, Julian lowered his head and walked out of the ballroom beneath a storm of disapproving stares. His double life had finally come to an end. 6 months passed quickly. Our lives gradually returned to a peaceful routine. Chloe never moved to Arizona. She remained in Columbus and expanded her own counseling practice. My daughter regained both her independence and the radiant smile she once had. Seeing her happy again brought me a sense of relief I could hardly describe. I often sat in my living room looking out the window and reflecting on everything that had happened. As a father, I learned an important lesson. Protecting your children does not mean solving every problem for them or making every decision on their behalf. Protecting them means helping them see the truth even when that truth is painful. Once the true nature of a liar is exposed, you must allow them to make their own choice. My daughter grew stronger through that painful experience. Thank you for staying with Dad's real-life revenge until the end of this story. Join our community by liking and subscribing to enjoy more compelling stories centered around family loyalty and justice. And as always, thank you for being part of this space. The rearview mirror in my car is still there. It is no longer a witness to deception. Now it reflects only my peaceful smile and my daughter's freedom. The truth may arrive late, but justice and the love of family will always be the strongest fortress of all.